She was worth $4 billion. He didn't know that when he sat down across from her. He didn't know it when she made him laugh so hard he spilled his water. He didn't know it when he told her about his daughter and watched something crack open behind her carefully composed eyes. He only found out weeks later staring at a magazine's cover in the break room, her face looking back at him, polished and untouchable. And the question that destroyed him wasn't, why didn't she tell me? It was, does any of it change what's already real? If this story already has you hooked, you're exactly who it was written for. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The invitation had been sitting on Nolan Beckett's kitchen counter for 11 days. He'd moved it twice, once to make room for Maisie's homework, once because he'd spilled coffee near it and didn't want to deal with what that might mean, but he hadn't thrown it away. That was the part he couldn't quite explain to himself. You're going, his coworker Derek had said 3 weeks ago, sliding the card across Nolan's desk with the confident authority of a man who had never once in his life doubted his own social instincts. The Larkspur Grand, open bar, nice people, not a meat market. Derek. Nolan. I have a 9-year-old. Your mother-in-law watches Maisie every other Thursday. I checked. Nolan had looked at him for a long moment. You checked? I asked Maisie, she said, and I'm quoting directly here. Daddy needs to go somewhere without me sometimes or he's going to get weird. Derek had paused. She's 9 and she's already smarter than you, which was more or less true. Maisie Beckett had inherited her mother's ability to name uncomfortable things with calm precision, and Nolan had been living with that particular talent for long enough to recognize when he was being outmaneuvered. So he'd kept the invitation, and on a Thursday evening in early October, when the air had that first real bite of autumn in it, and the Columbus skyline looked almost like a postcard through the cab window, Nolan straightened his collar in the reflection of his phone screen and told himself he wasn't nervous. He was just a man going to a social function. He was absolutely nervous. The Larkspur Grand was the kind of hotel that made you feel mildly underdressed the moment you walked through the door, regardless of what you were wearing. Nolan was wearing a charcoal blazer over a dark shirt, which he'd considered for approximately 45 minutes before deciding it was fine. Walking into the lobby, he immediately revised that opinion to maybe fine. The mixer was held in the Magnolia Room, a name that somehow managed to be both grandiose and pleasant, and when Nolan pushed through the double doors, he was met with the specific social pressure of a room full of adults, trying to look like they were having the effortless time they'd been promised. There were small tables arranged across the room, numbered cards at each, and a system that Derek had explained to him in the cab with the enthusiasm of a man briefing a military operation. You started at your assigned table. You had 30 minutes. Then the room coordinator rang a small bell and the women rotated to the next table. Nolan had listened to all of this and experienced the mild, persistent dread of someone who hadn't been on a first date in almost 8 years. Found table 7 near the back wall, where the lighting was slightly warmer and the noise from the room center didn't quite reach. Pulled out the chair, sat down, and spent approximately 90 seconds studying his water glass before he made himself look up. The woman across from him was already there. She was sitting with a particular stillness that wasn't stiffness exactly, more like someone who had long ago gotten comfortable occupying space without apologizing for it. Dark hair pulled back, though not severely. A wine-colored dress that was elegant without requiring anyone to comment on it. She was looking at the dessert display along the side wall with an expression that suggested she had already formed strong opinions about everything on it. She was, Nolan noticed, remarkably beautiful in a way that felt almost incidental, like it was beside the point. She turned and caught him looking. He didn't look away. Table 7, she said, by way of greeting. That's the one, he said. A short pause. She glanced toward the front of the room, where a man in a tan blazer, the event coordinator, was going through what appeared to be a laminated checklist with the focused energy of someone managing a minor emergency. He's going to announce something inspirational in about 4 minutes, she said. I can always tell. The clipboard is a warning sign. Nolan looked at the coordinator, looked back at her. What's he going to say? Something about connections and stepping outside your comfort zone. She picked up her water glass, possibly with a metaphor. About doors or journeys? She took a sip. He has the energy of a journey metaphor. Nolan laughed an actual, unguarded laugh, the kind that surprised him slightly. She noticed. He could tell because she didn't smile exactly, but something around her eyes changed. Celestine, she said, extending her hand. Nolan, he shook it. Her grip was firm and brief, no performance. 2 tables away, Derek had been watching this exchange. He leaned sideways to the woman at his table, a pleasant real estate attorney named Sandra, who had already figured out he was not her type and said quietly, "See my friend over there? Table 7? The one in the dark blazer? Yeah, I'm going to go give him an out." He'd done his homework on the other attendees. Celestine's registration form listed her profession as consultant and her name as only a first name, which struck him as vague. But what had caught his eye was the way the room's coordinator had been slightly too deferential when she arrived. Like someone who knew something the rest of the room didn't. Derek excused himself from Sandra and made his way to table 7 during a moment when the coordinator had, in fact, begun speaking about meaningful connections. He crouched slightly next to Nolan's chair. "Hey, I can get you moved if you want. I know a woman at table 3 who's a pediatric nurse. Seems more Derek. Yeah? Sit back down." Derek glanced at Celestine, who had turned her gaze politely toward the coordinator, as though she hadn't heard any of this. She had absolutely heard all of it. "You sure?" Derek asked. "Very." Derek straightened up, looked between them once, and retreated to table 4, which was closer to the bar, so it worked out for everyone. The coordinator's inspirational address did include a journey metaphor. Celestine had predicted it with such accuracy that Nolan found himself pressing his knuckles against his mouth to keep from laughing at the precise moment the man said, "Every great destination begins with a single step." "You knew," he said when the applause had died. "I've been to 3 of these." She said it without embarrassment, which he found unexpectedly refreshing. The speech evolved slightly each time, but the bones are the same. 3, he repeated. Why? She considered the question more seriously than he'd expected. Because I kept telling myself that discomfort was a reason to stop, and I've spent enough of my life letting discomfort make decisions for me. That was a more honest answer than the room probably deserved, and she seemed to know it. She shifted slightly, not retreating, just recalibrating. "What about you?" she asked. "First time?" "My coworker ambushed me with logistical information about my own schedule," Nolan said. "Technically, I didn't have an excuse." "That's a yes." "That's a yes." She almost smiled. He caught it before it was finished. "Your coworker, table 4? The one who tried to extract me, yes. He didn't do a very good job. He's enthusiastic. He means well." Nolan leaned back in his chair and glanced across the room at Derek, who had already made 3 people laugh and was halfway through what appeared to be a very animated story. "He's better at this than he looks." "Most people are better at things than they look," Celestine said. The 30 minutes passed and the bell rang. Nolan was mid-sentence. When it happened, he'd been explaining the strange geometry of a warehouse his company managed in Newark, which was somehow more interesting than it had any right to be, and the coordinator called for the rotation. Celestine didn't move, neither did Nolan. Across the room, a small shuffle occurred as partners redistributed. A few people glanced at table 7. Nolan looked at the coordinator, who raised his eyebrows. Nolan gave him a small, polite shake of his head. The coordinator made a note on his clipboard and moved on. "You didn't have to do that," Celestine said. "Neither did you." She folded her hands on the table in a gesture he would later come to recognize as her version of settling in. "Tell me about the daughter," she said. "You mentioned her when I asked what you were most looking forward to this weekend, and you said, Sunday breakfast." That was an interesting answer. He hadn't realized she'd noticed that. It had been a small thing, mentioned as part of a larger thought. "She's 9, he said. Her name's Maisie. Sunday breakfast is the one morning in the week where I don't have anywhere to be." "What do you make?" "Whatever she draws on the notepad." "Draws it?" "She draws pictures of it. I started doing it when she was 4 because she couldn't write yet, and I was trying to get her to eat something other than cereal. Now she's 9 and she still draws the order." He shook his head slightly. "Last week it was pancakes with strawberries on top, arranged to look like a face." "Did you execute it?" "I tried. The face looked like it had been through something." She laughed. Not the careful, social laugh of someone performing enjoyment, an actual laugh, short and unguarded, that seemed to catch her off guard as much as it did him. She pressed her lips together after, as though she hadn't quite meant to let it out. "What does she think of all this?" Celestine gestured in a way that suggested the event, the hotel, the general concept of her father being here. "She told me I needed to go somewhere without her or I'd get weird." He paused. "She's 9. She sounds like someone worth knowing." The way she said it, not "she sounds adorable," or that's so sweet, but someone worth knowing, was the first moment Nolan understood. He was talking to a person who was paying attention in a way most people at events like this weren't. He leaned forward slightly. "What's the obsession with used bookstores?" he asked. Blinked. "I didn't mention bookstores. Your tote bag has the logo of Bramblewood Books on it. It's a second-hand shop off 5th and Harrison. The logo's worn, so you've had the bag a while. So either you bought it as a souvenir or you go there enough that the bag is just part of the rotation." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully classify, something between suspicion and unexpected pleasure. "You're observant. I manage a regional logistics operation. Observation is basically the job description." "Bramblewood," she said slowly, like she was deciding how much to give, "has a section in the back past the military history and the oversized art books, where they keep the fiction that doesn't fit anywhere else. Books they couldn't categorize. I like uncategorizable things. What are you reading right now?" 3 things simultaneously, which my ex-husband considered a personality flaw. What did he consider a virtue? A short silence. Something moved across her face, not quite pain, but the shadow of it. "Efficiency," she said finally. He valued efficiency. Sounds exhausting. It was. She looked at him directly. It's a strange feeling, having a word that was meant as a compliment gradually become the reason a marriage fails. Nolan had not expected the conversation to go this direction. He hadn't expected any of this, the warmth of the table, the way the noise of the room had receded into something distant and irrelevant. The feeling of speaking to someone who answered questions in full rather than offering the socially acceptable partial version. He told her about Laura without planning to. Laura, his late wife, Maisie's mother. The way she'd died when Maisie was 3, a fast, unfair illness that had moved faster than their understanding of it, and the year afterward that Nolan still thought of in fragments. The strange business of getting up every morning when getting up felt genuinely optional. The discovery that grief, in its worst form, isn't dramatic. It's mostly just the unbearable tedium of days that keep arriving whether you're ready for them or not. He told her about the years of rebuilding learning to cook because Maisie needed to eat actual food, learning to talk about Laura with Maisie without crying every time, learning that stability wasn't something you waited to feel. It was something you practiced until it became real. Celestine's listened the way very few people listen, without flinching, without reaching for reassurance, without trying to offer something that would make the telling easier for them. "You didn't become smaller," she said when he finished. He looked at her. "Some people do," she said carefully. "Loss makes them, they close things down. I understand the instinct, but you didn't." "I have a 9-year-old, he said. Closing down isn't an option she was going to accept. That's part of it. She tilted her head slightly. But not all. He didn't answer that. He wasn't sure he had the words for it yet, and she didn't push. By the time the room had begun to thin couples drifting toward the exit, the coordinator looking at his clipboard with the resigned expression of a man who had seen a full bell rotation become optional before it was past 10 o'clock. Celestine looked around at the mostly empty tables with what appeared to be genuine surprise. "I lost track of the time," she said. The way she said it suggested this didn't happen to her often. "So did I," Nolan said. The dessert table had been mostly picked over. At some point, a server had deposited 2 small plates near them, chocolate something, caramel something else, which neither of them had touched. Celestine looked at the plates. "I already decided I wasn't going to like any of it," she said when I first came in. "What made you change your mind?" "I didn't," she said. Distracted. She picked up a fork, tried the chocolate, made a face that confirmed her original assessment had been correct, but continued eating it anyway with the resigned expression of someone who has committed. Nolan laughed and tried the caramel. "This one's better. It looks too organized," she said. "I don't trust a dessert that looks that neat." "You have strong opinions about dessert presentation." I have strong opinions about most things." She set down the fork. "People generally find it either fascinating or exhausting." "Which did your ex-husband find it?" "Fascinating for about 6 years," she said. "Exhausting for the 2 after that." Nolan said nothing for a moment. "Then, did you ever think about changing it?" "The strong opinions." She considered the question seriously, which he appreciated. "No," she said finally. "I thought about hiding it better." "That's different." She looked at him. "You don't seem exhausted by it." "Not remotely." She held that for a beat. Then she looked down at the table and straightened a small crease in the tablecloth, a precise absent gesture, the kind people make when something has moved them in a way they're not ready to name. I don't usually talk this much, she said quietly. I noticed. You're not alarmed by it? He reached over and picked up his water glass. Celestine, he said. The only thing about this evening that alarmed me was when your dessert prediction turned out to be accurate within about 2 minutes. Everything else has been fine. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled finally, fully, without editing it, and it changed her face in a way that made him completely understand why he'd stayed at table 7. They walked out of the Magnolia Room at 10:30. The lobby of the Larkspur Grand hummed with the quiet industry of a hotel that never fully sleeps. Celestine retrieved her coat from the check, and Nolan noticed the worn strap of the bramblewood tote alongside the clearly expensive fabric of the coat itself. The combination was unexpectedly interesting, like the woman carrying both things. Coffee at the Larkspur is overpriced, she said, pulling on her coat, but the place on Tremont is open until midnight, and they don't do anything clever with the menu. He recognized that for what it was, or at least what he hoped it was. I know the one, he said. I have a driver, she said straightforwardly. You're welcome to share it. Or I can drop you wherever. Either works, he said. They crossed the lobby together, their footsteps quiet on the marble floor. Outside, the October air had sharpened since he'd arrived. The city moved at its usual pace around them, unhurried, indifferent, full of its own concerns. In the cab earlier, he'd told himself he was just going to a social function. Still technically true. It just no longer felt like the whole story. The coffee place on Tremont was called Archer's, and it had the particular character of a business that had survived long enough to stop worrying about impressing anyone. The booths were vinyl, dark red, and cracked at the seams. The overhead lights were too bright. The menu was a laminated single page that listed 12 things and had clearly not been updated since sometime in the previous decade. It was, in other words, exactly what Celestine had promised: no cleverness, no atmosphere manufactured for the purpose of making customers feel like they'd discovered something. They took a booth near the window. Celestine ordered black coffee without looking at the menu. Nolan ordered the same, then added a slice of pie because it was listed as apple and he hadn't eaten since noon. The server, a heavyset woman in her 50s named Joyce, according to her name tag, wrote it down without ceremony and walked away. You've come here often enough that the dessert menu doesn't require investigation, Nolan observed. The pie is fine, Celestine said. Don't get excited. I have low expectations. Good. That's the correct posture for Archers. Joyce returned with the coffee and the pie faster than the kitchen had any right to produce it, set both down without comment, and disappeared. Nolan took a bite. The pie was in fact fine. You were right, he said. I usually am about places like this. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Places that have given up trying to be something they're not are generally more reliable than places still auditioning. He looked at her across the table. The lighting at Archer's was unforgiving, fluorescent, honest, the kind that showed everything the soft lighting of the Larkspur had softened. She looked exactly the same. That was the first thing he noticed. Some people shed several layers of attractiveness in harsh light. Celestine didn't. She just looked real. Earlier he said, You mentioned your ex-husband like it was already fully processed. Was it? She looked at him with an expression that was slightly narrowed, not quite a challenge. That's a direct question for a first coffee. You cannot answer it. A brief silence. She turned the mug in her hands. His name was Graham. We were married for 8 years. It ended about 3 years ago, and it ended slowly, which is worse than quickly, I think. Quick endings at least have the decency to be definitive. She paused. And no, I don't think it's fully processed. I think processed is the wrong word for something that changes your understanding of yourself. What would the right word be? Integrated, maybe. She looked at the window, where the reflection of the restaurant floated against the dark street outside. I learned things about myself in that marriage that I wouldn't have learned any other way. That I mistake control for safety. That I assume people will eventually reveal a version of themselves that's less than what I hoped. That I'm better at building things than I am at maintaining them. She turned back to him. Those aren't pleasant discoveries. They're honest ones. Honest discoveries about your own flaws generally are unpleasant, she said, with a wryness that didn't quite hide the weight underneath. Nolan rested his elbows on the table. I learned something like that too, he said, after Laura died. I thought I was a person who could carry things alone. I'd always believed that about myself, that I was self-sufficient, that needing people was a kind of structural weakness. He looked at the table. Grief corrected that very thoroughly. What changed? I started accepting help. Not because I wanted to. Because Maisie needed me to function, and I couldn't function alone. He exhaled slowly. I had this neighbor, an older woman, Mrs. Farrell. She's probably 70 now, who used to come over on Tuesday evenings with food in containers. She never asked if I wanted it. She'd just knock and hand it over and leave. She did it for almost a year. Celestine was watching him carefully. Did you ever thank her properly? I tried once. She told me to stop making it strange. He half smiled. She was right. It was only strange because I kept framing it as a debt instead of just kindness. Some people don't know what to do with uncomplicated kindness, Celestine said. She said it very quietly, and he understood she was also talking about herself. He sat with that for a moment. Joyce refilled their coffees without being asked. Outside, a car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping briefly across the window. Tell me about the bookstores, Nolan said, and she did. She talked about Bramblewood the way most people talked about places that had been with them through multiple versions of their own lives. She'd first gone in her mid-20s when she was working 70-hour weeks and living in a studio apartment with too much ambition and not enough furniture. The shop had been a form of decompression somewhere she could spend an hour without anyone needing anything from her. She'd gone back every few months for years, through the marriage and through the end of it, through the expansion of her career into something that had grown significantly larger than she'd originally planned, through the loneliness that comes with success when the success outpaces the relationships. I find things there that I didn't know I was looking for, she said. That sounds like a cliché. It sounds accurate, he said. What was the last thing you found that surprised you? Travel memoir from 1967. A woman who drove across the country alone at a time when women didn't do that, without considerable commentary from everyone around them. She wrote about it completely matter-of-factly, like the only interesting part was the landscape. Celestine smiled slightly. I read it in a weekend. I never do that anymore. What got in the way? She looked at him. Everything I built, she said simply. It wasn't a complaint, he understood. It was an honest accounting. She said it the way someone says the weather is cold as a fact about the world, not an invitation to fix anything. I think that's one of the lonelier trades, Nolan said. When the thing you spent your energy building becomes the reason you can't breathe the way you used to. Yes, she said, very precisely. That's it exactly. They left Archer's at 20 past midnight. He walked her to her car, a dark, understated sedan that he noted was nicer than average but not conspicuous, which somehow struck him as consistent with everything else he'd observed about her, and they stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold. I'm going to ask for your number, he said, not in the way the event organizer suggested, not in the spirit of meaningful connections and journey metaphors. In what spirit, then? In the spirit of wanting to talk to you again. She looked at him for a moment. He held it without flinching. She gave him her number. He texted her the next morning at a reasonable hour, not immediately, which was important, but not late enough to suggest he'd been debating it. Text said, Archer's pie, 6 out of 10. Still an improvement over the Larkspur's caramel situation. She responded 11 minutes later. The Larkspur caramel was a 4 at best. Your grading curve is too generous. He smiled at his phone and put it face down on his desk, which did not help him concentrate on the warehouse inventory report he was supposed to be finishing. It became coffee. Not at Archer's every time, sometimes at the place on Vine with the good espresso machine, but the inexplicable jazz they played at a volume slightly too high for conversation, which they both complained about and kept returning to anyway. Sometimes at the Bramblewood Cafe, tucked into the back of the bookstore near the uncategorizable fiction, where Celestine would occasionally pull a book from the shelf mid-conversation and read him a paragraph without explaining why, and he found, after the second or third time, that it was always relevant. It became Sundays. The Sundays happened the way most things that matter happen gradually, and then all at once until they were simply the fixed point around which the rest of the week arranged itself. Sunday mornings belonged to Maisie, always the drawn breakfast orders, the kitchen radio playing at whatever volume Maisie decided was appropriate, which varied dramatically by week. But Sunday afternoons became the space Nolan had not realized he was quietly reorganizing his life around. He told himself it wasn't serious. He had practiced at not telling himself the truth about things he wasn't ready to face. Celestine showed up at his apartment for the first time on a Sunday in mid-November, 3.5 weeks after the mixer. The original plan had been to meet at Bramblewood. She'd called when she was 10 minutes away and said her driver was dealing with a blocked road, and would it be all right if she came to him? And Nolan had said yes without thinking, and immediately looked around his apartment with the specific anxiety of someone who keeps their space clean but not company clean. Maisie was at the kitchen table finishing a book report when the knock came. Nolan answered the door. Celestine stood in the hallway in her coat and the bramblewood tote bag, holding a paper bag from the bakery on Clement Street. She looked briefly at the apartment behind him, cataloging. He understood, the way she cataloged everything, and then looked at him. "I brought things from the bakery," she said. "I didn't know what you had." "We have most things," he said, which was not entirely accurate. "Come in." She stepped in. Maisie looked up from her book report with the particular assessment of a child who had never been given reason to pretend she didn't notice things. "Are you Celestine?" Maisie asked. Celestine stopped walking. She looked at the girl at the kitchen table, small, with Laura's eyes and Nolan's stubbornness in the set of her jaw, book report in front of her, pencil still in hand. "I am. Dad mentioned you," Maisie said, with the neutral delivery of someone stating a fact rather than offering a judgment. "Did he say anything useful?" "He said you have strong opinions about bookstores." Dean set the bakery bag on the counter nearest her. "That's accurate." "We have a lot of books," Maisie said. "He probably told you that too." "He didn't mention it." Maisie looked briefly at her father with an expression that said, "You wasted good material," and then looked back at Celestine. "What kind of books do you like?" "Fiction mostly. Some history. Memoirs occasionally." "Non-fiction about dinosaurs?" Celestine pulled off her coat. "What specifically about them?" "Whether birds are actually dinosaurs." Maisie set her pencil down with the decisiveness of someone who had been waiting for a worthy opponent. "My teacher says they are. Marcus at school says that's not really what scientists mean, and Marcus is usually wrong, but he might not be wrong this time." Celestine hung her coat on the hook by the door, as though she'd done it before. Then she pulled out the chair across from Maisie and sat down. "Marcus is wrong," she said. "Birds are theropods. The lineage is unambiguous. What your teacher said is accurate. And, if you want, I can tell you exactly why. But I should warn you that the full explanation is about 10 minutes long, and your book report might need to wait." Maisie's face did a thing that Nolan recognized, that specific brightness that meant someone had cleared the bar she'd set without knowing it was there. "Go ahead," Maisie said, and pushed the book report aside. Nolan stood in his own kitchen and watched Celestine Rowe explain the evolutionary lineage of theropod dinosaurs to his 9-year-old daughter, using the back of the book report's scratch paper for diagrams, and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. They stayed at the kitchen table for an hour and a half. Maisie argued, because Maisie always argued not out of aggression but out of the honest desire to verify, to test, to ensure she'd understood correctly. Celestine argued back with the same energy, without condescending, and without softening her points the way adults often did with children, as though children needed the courtesy of being wrong gently. She treated Maisie like someone whose objections were worth answering at full strength. "She's interesting," Maisie told Nolan later, in the quiet after Celestine had left. She said it with her mother's tone, the one that meant the observation was final. Not a question, not a request for information. A verdict. "Yeah," Nolan said. "She knows a lot." "She does." Maisie climbed off the kitchen stool and picked up her book. "You should see her again," she said, with the casual authority of someone who considered the matter settled, and walked down the hall to her room. The Sundays continued. Celestine met Mrs. Farrell in the hallway one afternoon and spent 7 minutes discussing a book Mrs. Farrell was reading, which led to Mrs. Farrell telling Nolan afterward that she was sharp, that one in a tone that made it sound like a formal approval. He called Celestine that evening to report this. "Should I be flattered?" Celestine asked. "Mrs. Farrell disapproved of the last person I introduced to her," Nolan said. "She told me he was slippery, and she was correct. So yes, be flattered." "Who was the slippery person?" "Guy I used to carpool with who turned out to be aggressively dishonest on his expense reports." "That's a specific kind of slippery. Mrs. Farrell has a wide category." He could hear her smiling in the brief pause. "Tell her thank you." He did not tell her, in that conversation, that her approval had mattered to him. He was still finding the exact shape of what he was feeling, and some things needed more room than a phone call allowed. What he observed, over those weeks, was this: Celestine was different in his apartment than she was as in public. Not a different person, she was consistently herself, in a way that was actually one of her more notable qualities, but the texture of it changed. She relaxed in increments. She left her coat at the door without being asked after the third Sunday. She started bringing things, not gifts exactly, more like items she'd come across that seemed relevant. A book she'd finished that she thought he should read. A particular coffee she'd found that she wanted his opinion on. A folded article about a logistics technique that she'd cut out of something, without quite being able to explain why she thought he'd find it interesting. She started sitting in his kitchen, like someone who had always known how to fit in it. And he noticed what she never said. She never asked about the building or the rent. She never asked about his salary or what his career trajectory looked like. She never made any gesture, large or small, that suggested she was assessing his circumstances for adequacy. What she asked about was his work in the way someone asks about a thing they're genuinely curious about, what problems he was solving, what frustrated him, what he'd figured out this week that he hadn't known last week. She asked about Maisie with the same genuine curiosity. She listened to his answers and remembered them, which was the quiet evidence of actual attention. He asked her, one afternoon in early December, about her work. She had described herself as a consultant. He knew that much from the mixer's registration information, and she'd elaborated slightly since then. She worked in technology infrastructure. She sat on several boards. She traveled more than she liked. The details she offered were always technically accurate and consistently vague in a way he'd noticed but hadn't pushed. What kind of infrastructure? He asked that afternoon. She was standing at his bookshelf, running her finger along the spines the way she always did when she was slightly distracted. Systems, she said. Networks. Ways that large things connect to each other. That's still quite broad. It is, she agreed, and didn't add anything. He watched the back of her head. He'd developed, over 35 years, a reasonably good instinct for when someone was being vague by accident and when it was deliberate. This was deliberate. He made a note of it and chose not to push, because some things revealed themselves in time, and some things needed to be left room to breathe before they could. He had learned that too, in the years after Laura. What he didn't know, what he had no framework for yet, was the scale of what she was carrying. What he understood was that she had more money than her manner suggested. The driver, the coat, the ease with which she navigated certain spaces. But there were degrees of more, and he was operating on a misunderstanding of the magnitude. The Saturday that corrected that was an ordinary Saturday in mid-December. Nolan was at work, mid-afternoon, doing the unglamorous administrative work that occupied the second half of every week: variance reports, schedule coordination, an email thread with the Newark facility that had been ongoing since October and showed no signs of resolution. He was standing at the break room coffee machine waiting for it to finish doing something mechanical when Derek walked in, holding a magazine and wearing an expression Nolan had never seen on him before. It was the expression of someone who had just discovered information they were not certain how to handle. "Hey," Derek said. "Hey, so." Derek set the magazine on the counter. It was an issue of a business publication, the kind with glossy profiles and photographs of executives in dramatic lighting. He tapped the cover. Nolan looked. The cover photograph showed a woman at a conference table, mid-conversation, animated and fully present in the way she was in all the spaces she occupied. The lighting was professional. The setting was polished. She looked, in the photograph, exactly like who she was, a person in command of significant things. The name in the caption was Celestine Rowe. The headline read, "Building the Future: How Rowe Infrastructure Became a $4 billion Empire." Nolan picked up the magazine. He read the headline again. He looked at the photograph. He put the magazine back down on the counter. Derek said nothing, which was, for Derek, an extraordinary act of restraint. Nolan drove home in a silence that wasn't quite anger, and wasn't quite hurt, and wasn't quite anything he had a clean name for. It was the silence of someone recalculating, not replacing what he knew with something new, but trying to understand how the thing he knew fit with the thing he hadn't. Celestine, standing at his bookshelf. Celestine arguing dinosaur taxonomy with his daughter. Celestine at Archer's with her hands around a coffee mug, saying honest discoveries about your own flaws are generally unpleasant in the tone of someone who had earned the observation. None of that was a lie. He was clear on that. What it was a gap. A $4 billion gap. He sat in his parked car outside his building for about 10 minutes, long enough to understand what the core of what he was feeling actually was. It wasn't that she had money. It wasn't even that she had that much money. It was that she'd been deliberate about withholding it, and he needed to know what that deliberateness meant before anything else made sense. He called her. She answered on the second ring. "I'm outside," he said. Pause. "Outside where? My building. I just got home," he exhaled. "I need to ask you something." Another pause, different from the first. Pause that knew what was coming. "All right," she said. "The Sunday's real?" The silence on the line was not empty. He could hear her breathing, heard the small shift of movement she was standing, he thought, and she'd stopped when he asked. "Yes," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was steady. Every single one. He held the phone. The dashboard of his car was fogged slightly from his breath. Across the street, a kid on a bicycle cut through the parking lot of the corner store without looking. "Then the rest is just numbers," he said. She didn't speak immediately. When she did, her voice had changed something in it, had cracked open very slightly, in the way of someone who has been holding a breath for longer than they realized and has just been given permission to let it go. "Nolan." She said his name the way she said most things without elaboration, but it carried more in this instance than it usually did. "Come over tomorrow," he said. "Maisie wants to continue the dinosaur argument. She found something in a library book that she thinks is going to be a problem for your position." A small sound, not quite a laugh, but close. Her position was weaker than mine. "She's been preparing for 4 days. I'd bring notes." "I'll be there at noon," she said. He hung up. He sat in his car for another minute, long enough to be honest with himself about what he'd decided when he said the rest was just numbers. It wasn't a dismissal of the complication. The complication was real and would remain real, and there would be consequences he couldn't fully see yet. He understood that. But he was 35 years old and had spent 4 years learning the hard way, which things in his life could not be replaced by any form of money or practicality or strategic good sense. And the woman who had been sitting at his kitchen table, arguing with his daughter about birds and dinosaurs and evolutionary lineage, the woman who arrived every Sunday with something she'd found that she thought he'd find interesting, the woman who had told him in a diner with 2 bright lights that she mistook control for safety and was still trying to figure out how to stop that woman, was not a complication. That woman was the thing he wasn't willing to reduce to a calculation. He got out of the car, went upstairs, and started on dinner. Maisie was at the kitchen table again, which was where she spent most of her evenings, and she looked up when he came in and said, "Did something happen?" "Why?" "You're making the face." "What face?" "The one where you're thinking about something that isn't the food you're making." She studied him with the patient attention of someone who had been reading him for 9 years. "Is it Celestine?" "I found something out about her today," he said. Something she hadn't mentioned. Maisie processed this. "Something bad?" "No, just large." His daughter turned this over for a moment with the deliberate consideration she applied to most things. Then she said, "Is she still the same person?" He looked at her across the kitchen. "Yeah," he said. "She is." "Then you're making a big deal out of nothing," Maisie said, and returned to her book report. He stood in his kitchen for a moment longer, looking at his daughter, and thought that she had her mother's way of landing directly on the truth of things without any apparent effort, and that he was going to be both proud of it and slightly exhausted by it for the rest of his life. He started dinner. The window above the sink showed the street below. The November dark had come early, and the city was doing what it always did, moving at its own pace, indifferent and continuous. Somewhere across town, he imagined Celestine was sitting with whatever she sat with on Saturday evenings, and that the phone call had landed in her in a way she was still measuring. He hoped she understood what he'd meant. He thought she did. She was, as he'd established very early at a fluorescent-lit table in a nearly empty hotel ballroom, remarkably good at understanding things accurately. That was the other quality he'd cataloged and held onto. And it was, ultimately, the one that mattered. The first photographer showed up on a Wednesday. Nolan didn't notice him immediately. He was walking out of the logistics center at 6:10, keys in hand, thinking about whether there was enough pasta at home to make the thing Maisie had requested for dinner, which she had communicated via a drawing that morning, depicting what appeared to be spaghetti, but could also have been a very optimistic interpretation of whatever he had in the pantry. The man with the camera was standing near the far end of the parking lot, and Nolan registered him the way you register any stranger in a parking lot briefly, without concern, and kept walking. He only understood what had happened when he saw the photograph 3 days later. Derek sent it to him without comment, just a link to a gossip column website Nolan had never visited and had no desire to visit, with a subject line that read, "Don't freak out." The The photograph showed Nolan mid-stride, keys in his hand, looking like a man thinking about pasta. And beneath it read, "Who is Nolan Beckett?" The Columbus logistics manager, spending Sundays with Row Infrastructure's Billionaire founder. The article was short and unpleasant. It was the kind of article that didn't make accusations directly, but structured its sentences in a way that implied things it didn't have the evidence to say outright. It mentioned his job title and salary bracket with the specificity of someone who had made a few phone calls. It mentioned that Celestine Rowe had a net worth that the article's author estimated at somewhere between 3 and 5 billion, depending on current valuations. It asked in its final paragraph whether the founder of one of the country's most significant infrastructure firms had found love or found a complication, a phrasing so deliberately vague it could mean almost anything and was clearly designed to. Nolan read it once and closed the tab. He called Celestine. She answered on the first ring. "I know," she said, before he could speak.
How long have you known?
"My communications director flagged it this morning." A pause. "I should have warned you that this was a possibility. I've been managing my public profile carefully for years, but when someone is persistent enough..." "Celestine." He stopped her. "I'm not calling because I'm angry. I'm calling because I need to know what this looks like from your side and what you think is going to happen next." She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone choosing words with precision. "More of it," she said finally. "If the first piece generates traffic, others will follow. That's the pattern. And the things they'll say." Yes, she didn't soften it. He appreciated that. "The things they'll say will be unpleasant, and some of them will be about your intentions, and most of them will be inaccurate. I want you to know that I have people who can manage the narrative." "I don't want anyone managing a narrative about me," he said, more sharply than he'd intended. He heard it in the air between them and kept going, more carefully. "I'm not saying I'm handling this alone. I'm saying I need to understand it before anyone starts managing anything, because it involves my life and Maisie's life, and I don't hand those over to communications directors." Another pause. This one felt different, not uncomfortable, but weighted in a way that told him she was recalibrating and that the recalibration was genuine. "That's fair," she said. "I'm sorry. I defaulted to the way I handle these things professionally, and this isn't a professional situation." "No," he said. "It isn't." They talked for an hour that night after Maisie was in bed. He sat at his kitchen table in the quiet apartment, and they worked through it the way they'd worked through most things directly, without either of them pretending the difficulty wasn't real. Celestine told him honestly what the scrutiny looked like from inside her world, the advisors who would raise concerns, the business press that treated her personal life as an extension of her corporate narrative, the specific way wealthy women in visible positions were analyzed when they made personal choices that didn't fit the expected template. Told him that there were people on her board who considered a middle-class single father from Columbus a variable they hadn't accounted for, and that some of them had already made their feelings quietly known. "What did you tell them?" Nolan asked. "That my personal life is not a board agenda item," she said. He was silent for a moment. "And what did they say to that?" "They said what people in rooms like that always say. They expressed concern. They used words like optics and stakeholder confidence." A slight edge in her voice. "I've been managing people like that for 15 years. I know how to hold a line. I know you do," he said. "I'm not worried about them." "What are you worried about?" He turned his coffee mug in a slow circle on the table. Through Maisie's closed door, he could see the thin line of light she was probably still reading, which meant she wasn't asleep yet, which meant the conversation was happening at a lower volume than it might have otherwise. "Maisie," he said quietly, "I'm worried about what this looks like inside her school. 9-year-olds are not subtle processors. They go home and repeat things their parents say, and their parents are currently reading a column that implies her father is some kind of opportunist." The silence on Celestine's end was different from all the other silences he'd catalogued. This one had something in it he'd heard from her only a few times, before the sound of someone who has encountered a consequence they hadn't fully mapped. "I hadn't thought about the school," she said. "Honestly. No qualifier, no immediate pivot to solutions." "I know," he said. Not unkindly. "I'm sorry," she said. And this time the apology didn't have the professional texture of the first one. It landed the way she meant it. They didn't resolve anything that night. Exactly. Resolution wasn't the point. The point was that they were both in possession of the same information and standing in the same place relative to it, which was the thing that mattered when the information was difficult. He didn't sleep well. The second photograph came 4 days later. This one was worse because it included Maisie, not a close shot. Nothing that would identify her specifically, but a photo taken at a distance of Nolan, walking her out of school, her backpack visible. Her small profile caught mid-sentence as she talked at him the way she always talked, with her hands and her whole body. Image was taken with a long lens and was grainy in the way of something shot from a significant distance. The accompanying article described her only as Beckett's young daughter, but the fact of the photograph existing at all of a camera pointed at his 9-year-old from across the street without his knowledge landed on Nolan's chest like a weight that had no clean parallel in anything he'd experienced before. He sat with the image on his phone for a long time. Maisie was currently 20 feet away in the kitchen, arguing cheerfully with the television about something a nature documentary host had said about migratory birds. She had no idea. She was making the specific sounds she made when she thought a supposed expert was being imprecise, which was a sound Nolan had come to think of as one of the more reliable signs that she was in a good mood and fully herself. He looked at the grainy photograph. He looked at the closed kitchen doorway. He looked at the photograph again. He called Celestine. He told her about the image without leading up to it, just said what it was directly, because he'd learned that leading up to things she needed to know wasted time neither of them had. She went quiet in a way he'd never heard before. It was not the processing quiet, or the choosing words quiet, or even the recalibrating quiet. It was the quiet of someone who has just encountered a specific kind of horror and is deciding what to do with it before they say anything. "I can get a security detail arranged by tomorrow morning," she said finally. "For you and for Maisie both. Discreet, plain clothes, nothing that would make her school environment feel strange." "Celestine, I know that's not what you want to hear." "It's not that it's not what I want to hear." He stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window, keeping his voice low. "Security detail is a response to a world I don't live in. My daughter rides the bus. She has friends who live 2 blocks away that she walks to after school. We go to Bramblewood on Saturday mornings, and she climbs on the step stools to reach the top shelves, because she's short and refuses to ask me for help. I'm not putting 2 people in plain clothes into that life and calling it discreet. Then what do you want to do?" Her voice was careful, but not controlled in the way it sometimes was. It had a rawness in it he'd only begun to recognize in the last month, the sound of Celestine when she was genuinely as uncertain rather than professionally composed. He exhaled. Outside, the street was doing what streets do, moving, continuous, unaware. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I know that the question isn't what I want to do. The question is what's right for her." "They're the same question," Celestine said. "Not always." She didn't argue with that, which was how he knew she understood what he was saying under the words he'd used. What he was saying, beneath the specific sentences, was this: there is a version of this where I'm the one who decides what my daughter's life looks like. And there is a version where that decision starts being made by the size of your world and the people in it who point cameras at children from across streets. And those 2 versions are not both acceptable to me. He didn't say it like that. He didn't have to. She heard it. "I need some time," he said. "Okay," she said, quietly. "Not from you," he added, because he wanted that clear. "From the situation. I need to think without the situation getting louder while I'm thinking." "I understand," she said, and he believed she did. What happened over the next 2 weeks was not dramatic in the visible sense. There was no single confrontation, no defining moment. What there was instead was an accumulation, the specific weight of small things. His coworkers, who had been uniformly decent people in his experience, began relating to him with a slightly altered frequency. Not unkindly, but with the particular carefulness people adopt when they've read something about someone they know and are now uncertain which version of the person is the real one. He caught 2 separate conversations stopping in break rooms when he walked in. He received a text from a college friend he hadn't heard from in 2 years, saying, "Hey man, saw you in the news." Wild stuff, which was friendly in intention and landed wrong anyway. His manager, an otherwise practical man named Hodgins, who'd worked in logistics for 30 years and generally treated human drama as a productivity variable, called him into his office on a Tuesday and said, with genuine awkwardness, that he just wanted to make sure things were okay on Nolan's end, and that the company was aware that outside attention can create distractions, and that HR was available as a resource. It was delivered with such careful neutrality that Nolan couldn't find anything specifically objectionable about a single word of it, which was its own kind of unpleasant. He drove Maisie to school. On a Thursday, he'd started driving instead of the bus without explaining why. And Maisie had accepted this without comment, which meant she'd noticed something was off, even if she didn't have the full picture. And at pickup that afternoon, a mother he'd spoken to twice at school events materialized next to him on the sidewalk with the determined friendliness of someone who had prepared a conversation. "I just want to say," she began, "that I think it's great, you know? That someone like her, love doesn't have a price tag, right?" He looked at her. "I'm sure your intentions are completely genuine," she added quickly, as though the clarification would help. He thanked her with the politeness he'd learned to use as a lid for things he didn't want to release in public, and steered Maisie toward the car. In the car, Maisie sat in the back seat and said nothing for about 4 blocks. Then she said Emma Larson said something today. He glanced in the rearview mirror. What did she say? She said her mom told her that you're dating a really rich lady and that people are saying you're doing it for the money. Maisie's voice was careful in a way that was not quite her ordinary. Careful, it had an edge of effort in it, like she was deciding how much of what she was actually feeling to let him hear. I told her that was stupid. How did she respond? She said her mom read it online. Maisie looked out the window. I said her mom should read better things online. He watched the road. I'm fine. A pause. But I don't like people saying things about you that aren't true. Neither do I. What are you going to do about it? He didn't answer immediately. She watched him in the mirror, and he watched her, and the city moved past the windows, and neither of them said anything for the next 2 blocks. What he was going to do was something he'd known for 3 days was coming, and had been working out in the only way he knew how to work things out quietly, inside, where the logic of it had the room it needed to become clear without being interrupted. He called Celestine that night. Maisie was in bed this time. Actually asleep, he'd checked. The way he still checked, even though she was 9 and considered this unnecessary. And he sat at the kitchen table in the dark apartment with just the under-cabinet light on, which was the setting he'd come to associate with the conversations that required him to say things correctly on the first attempt. I need to tell you something, he said. I know, she said. He had the impression she'd been waiting. I can't do this to her, he said. Not the way it is right now. Whatever is happening between us, and whatever it could be, it's not worth a camera pointed at my daughter from across the street. It's not worth her sitting in a car telling me what a classmate said. Her mother read online. He stopped. Started again. I love spending Sundays with you. I love the way you are with her. I love that you argued about dinosaurs for an hour and wrote diagrams on the back of a book report. I'm not saying any of that isn't real. But Celestine said, but she didn't choose this life. She doesn't have the option of opting out. And I'm the one who's supposed to protect the part of her life that belongs to her, and right now I'm not doing that. The silence on the line was the longest one he'd heard from her. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but it wasn't an angry one. It was the silence of someone receiving something that hurts and choosing to receive it honestly rather than deflect it. I understand, she said. Celestine, no, she said. I mean it. I understand. I'm not a slight intake of breath. I'm not going to argue with you about Maisie. That's not an argument I would make. I know you wouldn't. I just need you to know, she said carefully, that I'm not going to handle this by making you come back. I'm not going to deploy anything not lawyers, not press strategies, not conversations with people who could make the noise quieter in ways you'd find objectionable. If you need to step back, you step back. I'm not going to turn this into something you can't walk away from cleanly. He sat with that for a moment. That matters to me, he said. That you said that. I know it does. Another pause. It's also the hardest thing I've said in a long time. Just so you know. He closed his eyes. The apartment was very quiet. Down the hall, Maisie was sleeping in the easy, complete way that children sleep when the world hasn't yet convinced them that nights are a good time to worry about things. He'd spent years protecting that specific quality of her sleep, and it was not a thing he was willing to negotiate. I'll call you, he said. Whenever you're ready, she said. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after hanging up. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. The logic of the decision was sound. He'd been over it enough times to know that, and the decision itself was the right one. He'd made right decisions before that still cost him something, and he'd learned to let the cost be what it was without trying to correct it. He just sat and let it cost. He told himself he'd done the right thing the next morning while making breakfast. He told himself again on the drive to Maisie's school. He told himself every day for the next 11 days, with the consistency of a man who knows that repetition doesn't make something hurt less, but does eventually make it possible to function alongside the hurt. On the 12th day, a Saturday, there was a knock at his door at 11 in the morning. He opened it, and Celestine was standing in the hallway, without her driver, without the Bramblewood tote, without anything he recognized from the architecture of their Sundays. She was wearing a coat he hadn't seen before, and she had clearly not rehearsed this because she opened her mouth and then closed it, which was not something she did. I told myself I wasn't going to do this, she said. And yet, he said, I've been sitting with the thing you said about not deploying anything, she continued. And the words were coming out with less of her usual precision, which he recognized as meaning she was genuinely off script, about not making you come back. And I meant it. I still mean it. But what I didn't account for when I said it was that I wasn't only trying to give you space to leave. I was also, she stopped. Started again. I've been standing in my own life using distance as the thing that protects me from being disappointed by people for so long that has become the automatic response. Someone needs space, I create it. Someone struggles with what I have, I accommodate the struggle from a safe distance. And that worked. For years it worked. Because it meant I was never in the position of wanting something from someone who might not want to give it. She looked at him directly. I don't want to do that anymore. Not with you. Not with this. He held the door and said nothing. I'm not here to talk you out of your decision, she said. I'm here because I think there's something I didn't say that night that you had the right to hear. She paused. I don't need you to come into my world. I'm not asking you to become a feature of my public life or a figure in my professional orbit. I'm asking if we could build something that belongs to neither of us exclusively and both of us equally. And I should have said that more clearly before it got to the point where you felt the only option was protecting Maisie from the version of this that we had, rather than finding a different version together. From somewhere inside the apartment came a sound, the specific creak of Maisie's door, which had needed a new hinge for approximately 6 months and was always announcing itself. Both of them heard it. Maisie appeared in the hallway behind her father, sleep-warm and sock-footed, book tucked under her arm. She looked at Celestine. She looked at her father. She looked at Celestine again with the flat, assessing patience of someone who had been following the shape of a situation even without all the details. You both look weird, she announced. We're talking, Nolan said. I can see that. Maisie addressed Celestine directly. Did you come to fix it? Celestine blinked once. That was my intention, yes. Maisie nodded slowly, as though this was a satisfactory answer to a question she'd been carrying for a while. Then she said, in the perfectly calm voice she used when she considered something settled, if you both love each other, why are you saying goodbye? Neither adult spoke. Maisie waited for approximately 3 seconds, decided the silence confirmed everything she needed to know, and walked past both of them to the kitchen, where the sound of the refrigerator opening indicated she had moved on to the more immediate concern of breakfast. Nolan looked at Celestine. Celestine looked at him. Between them, in the air of the doorway, was everything that a 9-year-old had just reduced to a single question that neither of them had a clean answer to, because the only answer either of them actually had was the one that made the goodbye make no sense at all. He stepped back from the door. Come in, he said. Came in. She sat at his kitchen table for 3 hours that Saturday morning, and somewhere in the middle of it Maisie's made everyone toast without being asked, which was her way of deciding that the situation had resolved itself sufficiently to warrant breakfast participation. The toast was slightly burned on one side because Maisie had gotten distracted mid-process by a question she wanted to ask Celestine about a book she'd been reading, and nobody commented on the burned side because it didn't matter. Nolan ate his without remarking on it. Celestine ate hers the same way. Maisie ate hers while talking about the book, apparently unbothered by her own inconsistent execution. This was the first Saturday in nearly 2 weeks that had felt like anything resembling normal, and all 3 of them knew it, even if only one of them was 9 years old, and therefore lacked the vocabulary to say so. What Nolan and Celestine worked out that morning was not a plan exactly. It was more like a set of understandings that had finally been said out loud rather than assumed. The shape of it was this: they were not going to let anyone else define the terms of what they were building. Not the business press, not Celestine's board, not well-meaning mothers at school pickups, not Derek with his genuinely good intentions and occasionally poor timing. They would make the decisions, together, before those decisions needed to be made in response to someone else's agenda. That was the first understanding. The second was about Maisie. Celestine said it. Directly, looking at Nolan across the kitchen table, with the coffee going cold between them. Whatever happens between us, her stability comes first. I'm not a variable she should have to account for. If there is ever a point where my presence in her life creates more difficulty than it resolves, you tell me and I adjust. I mean that without qualification. Nolan looked at her for a moment. She's already decided about you, he said. She decided that first day with the dinosaurs. Children change their minds. Maisie doesn't. Not about people. He paused. Got her mother's instincts. Laura knew who people were in the first 20 minutes. Accurate every time. It was mildly unsettling. Celestine absorbed this quietly. What did Laura's instincts say about you? She asked. Question was careful. She'd learned the territory around Laura's name the way you learn any significant geography with attention. She told me I was the stubbornest person she'd ever met, who had somehow turned it into a virtue, Nolan said. She wasn't wrong. Celestine looked at him steadily. No, she said. She wasn't. The third understanding was about Celestine's world, and how much of it was going to require management. She told him plainly, that morning, that she intended to address the speculation directly, not with a press conference or a statement, nothing that would amplify it by treating it as news, but with a quiet, deliberate series of decisions that would make her position unmistakably clear to the people in her professional orbit, who had been treating her personal life as a variable in their calculations. There are 3 people on my executive team, she said, who I know have been talking about you to each other and potentially to outside contacts. They're not doing it maliciously. They're doing it because they believe that managing me includes managing my personal exposure, which is a belief I've allowed to develop by being too hands-off about where the line is. What are you going to do? Have 3 conversations, she said, in the next week, and make the line very clear. She turned her coffee mug. I should have done it sooner. I didn't because she paused, with the particular hesitation of someone about to say something true that they've been postponing. Because I have a habit of tolerating behavior that makes me uncomfortable when the people engaged in it are professionally useful to me. It's something I'm aware of and not particularly proud of. That's a common thing, Nolan said. It's a thing I want to be less common in myself, she said, which was not an argument and not a defense, just a statement about what she expected from her own behavior going forward. He nodded once. That was enough. What happened in the weeks after that Saturday was not a smooth transition, because nothing real is smooth. It was a series of adjustments. Some of them awkward, some of them requiring more conversation than anticipated, some of them landing correctly on the first attempt and others needing to be revised. Celestine had those 3 conversations with her executive team. He didn't ask for details, and she didn't volunteer them, but the tone of whatever was said was clear enough from the subsequent silence in the press. Columns stopped. The gossip items dried up. The photograph situation, which had briefly involved a freelance photographer, who had apparently decided Nolan's building was worth periodic surveillance, ended after Celestine's legal team communicated with enough specificity that the interest evaporated entirely. She told Nolan about the legal communication afterward, with the slight tension of someone uncertain whether it would be received as help or as overreach. Was that okay, she asked, to handle it that way? He thought about it honestly. Yes, he said. That was your world handling a problem your world created. That's different from you trying to fix my life with money. She held that distinction with the care of someone filing it somewhere useful. I want to be clear about that line, she said. Always. If I cross it, tell me I will, he said. And I expect the same. The same what? If I'm being a stubborn idiot about accepting something that would actually help, tell me. She looked at him with the expression he'd come to think of as her version of amusement, the slightly narrowed eyes, the almost smile. I've been compiling a list, she said, I figured. Maisie's school situation corrected itself with the particular swiftness of 9-year-old social dynamics, which operated on a news cycle considerably faster than the adult world. Emma Larson's comment was superseded within a week by a more compelling piece of playground information. Apparently, a 5th grader had brought a lizard to class, and the resulting disruption had eclipsed most prior concerns, and by the time January arrived, Maisie reported no further incidents with the directness she always used to indicate that a matter was closed. Emma said she was sorry. Maisie mentioned one evening, unprompted, over dinner. Did you accept it? Nolan asked, obviously. Maisie speared a piece of pasta. It wasn't her fault. Her mom said something dumb and she repeated it. Kids repeat what their parents say. It's just how it works. Nolan looked at his daughter. When did you get this pragmatic? I've always been pragmatic, Maisie said, with the serene confidence of someone who believed this completely. You just don't always notice. He glanced at Celestine, who was sitting across from Maisie at the table, which had become a regular configuration by this point. 3 or 4 evenings a week, and Celestine was looking at her plate with the particular expression she wore when she was suppressing something she didn't want to interrupt. Later, when Maisie had gone to do homework, and they were washing dishes in the way they'd fallen into, Nolan washing and Celestine drying, because Nolan had explained that it was faster, and she had not argued even though she thought he was wrong about that. She said, "She's going to be formidable." "She already is," Nolan said. "I mean in the other direction. When she's grown. Whatever she decides to do with herself." Celestine dried a plate and set it in the cabinet. "She's going to be the kind of person who walks into rooms and changes what's happening in them. She gets it from her mother and from you." He handed her another dish. "I'm mostly just the stubborn one." "Stubbornness, correctly applied, is its own form of intelligence," she said. "I know this from personal experience." What Celestine had not told him in those weeks of recalibration was what the adjustment cost her on her own side of the equation. He learned it gradually, the way he learned most things about her in increments, through accumulation rather than revelation. Her world had been organized for years around a particular kind of efficiency. Her time was managed. Her access was mediated. The enormous house she lived in, fact, he still hadn't fully assimilated, the scale of it. The distance between its architecture and the life he actually understood ran on a staff whose job was essentially to prevent friction. She had not, in the years since her marriage ended, made any version of her private life available to the kind of daily proximity that ordinary relationships required. She'd kept people at a curated distance, present enough to feel connected, distant enough to remain in control of what they saw. Nolan's apartment and the life inside it admitted no such architecture. The first time she spent a full Sunday, from morning to evening arriving, when Maisie was still in pajamas at 9 in the morning, and not leaving until after dinner, she was visibly, subtly off balance in a way that had nothing to do with discomfort and everything to do with unfamiliarity. Not with the people, with the texture of it, with the interruptions and the noise level, and the fact that things happened in Nolan's apartment without anyone arranging them in advance. Maisie changed the plan 3 times before noon. The grocery run took 40 minutes longer than expected, because Maisie wanted to come and then had opinions about every item. Lunch happened at 2 because nobody had been paying attention to the time. Celestine participated in all of it, but he caught her twice, with the look of someone processing a sensory input they hadn't anticipated, not overwhelmed, but recalibrating in real time. Like someone standing in a new kind of weather, trying to decide how to dress for it. He didn't comment on it in the moment. That evening, after Maisie was in bed, and Celestine was getting her coat from the hook by the door, he said, "How was that? Actually?" She turned to look at him. "Honestly? Always." She took a moment. "Disorienting," she said. "But in a way I haven't felt in a long time." She paused, searching for precision. "My house runs without me. All of it. If I'm not there, nothing stops or changes, because all the systems are in place to function regardless. It's very efficient." She looked at him. "Your apartment stops when you leave it. Starts when you're in it. Nothing in it works without you and Maisie being the active element." She pulled her coat on. "I don't know how to explain why that's affecting me as much as it is." "You don't have to explain it," he said. "I'm trying to," she said, with a slight frustration that he recognized as being directed at herself rather than at him. "Because it matters, and I want you to know what it is." He waited. "It's the first place in years," she said finally, "where I can tell that I'm actually there. Not performing being there. Not managing being there. Actually, physically, present in a place where the presence matters to how the room feels." She looked at her coat collar, straightening it. "I forgot what that felt like." He crossed the kitchen and stood near enough that she had to look up at him slightly. "For what it's worth," he said, "the room does feel different when you're in it." She held his gaze. "Don't be smooth about it," she said. "I'm not," he said. "It's a logistical observation. The noise level increases. The coffee situation improves significantly, and Maisie stops arguing with me and starts arguing with you, which is a net positive for everyone." She pressed her lips together to contain whatever that was doing to her expression. Didn't entirely work, he saw it. "Good night, Nolan," she said. "Good night." She left. He stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed and thought that the particular combination of precision and vulnerability she carried the way she could be both completely in command of a boardroom and completely off balance in a Sunday morning was one of the stranger and more specific things he'd come to love about her, and that love was, he understood now, no longer a word he was using internally with any reservation. He'd stopped reserving it sometime in January, though he couldn't identify the exact moment. February arrived with the kind of weather Columbus did. In February, heavy and gray and deliberate in its misery, and somewhere in the middle of it, Celestine began spending Saturdays too. Not because anyone had proposed it. It happened the way most of the permanent things between them had happened, incrementally, without a decision meeting, until it was simply the arrangement. She learned to navigate his kitchen, which was smaller than any room in her house, and had a drawer that stuck and a cabinet hinge that needed replacement, and a coffee maker that Nolan had owned since before Maisie was born, and had no intention of replacing because it worked. She did not replace the coffee maker, though he could see it cost her something. She fixed the drawer hinge herself one afternoon when he was on a work call, using a screwdriver from his junk drawer, because she said she needed something to do while she waited, and she'd been meaning to mention the drawer for 3 weeks. Came out of the bedroom to find her crouched in front of the kitchen cabinet, with the drawer on the floor beside her, and a look of concentration that was identical to the look she had in the middle of difficult conversations. "You fixed it," he said. "The screw was stripped," she said, standing up. "I used a slightly larger one from the collection of miscellaneous hardware you have rubber banded together in the back of that drawer. It'll hold indefinitely now." He looked at the drawer. Opened it, closed it, opened it again. "Why do you know how to do that?" "I grew up in a house where things broke and stayed broken unless someone fixed them," she said, matter-of-factly, in a tone that offered the information without inviting elaboration. She put the screwdriver back in the junk drawer. "Most of what I know about infrastructure started with broken things." He looked at her for a moment. She met his eyes, and there was something in hers that said she'd given him something real just now. Something from a part of her history she generally kept behind other information. He didn't reach for it or try to open it further. He just held it. "Thank you," he said, "for the drawer." "Don't thank me for the drawer," she said. "It was bothering me." Maisie, who had been watching all of this from the kitchen doorway, with the composed interest of a nature documentary host, observing something in its natural habitat, said, "I told him the drawer needed fixing in September. Your father," Celestine said, "has a complicated relationship with household maintenance." "Tell me about it," Maisie said, and went back to her book. Spring came. The gray gave way to the particular tentative green of an Ohio March that hadn't decided whether it was committed yet, and the Sundays expanded further into territory that neither of them mapped consciously, but both of them recognized as the territory of people building something shared. They went to Bramblewood on Saturday mornings, all 3 of them, Maisie climbing the step stools, Nolan circling the history section, Celestine in the back near the uncategorizable fiction, occasionally passing a book over the shelf to Nolan with a particular look that meant this one. Trust me. He read 3 of those books in the spring. He found that her judgment in this, as in most things, was generally sound. She brought Maisie to an indoor exhibition about deep-sea life at the Science Museum downtown on a Saturday in March, just the 2 of them, because Nolan had a site visit that ran long. He'd offered to reschedule. Celestine had said there was no reason to. He'd come home at 6 to find them on the living room floor with a library book about bioluminescent organisms open between them, Maisie talking at a pace that suggested she'd been going for some time and had no plans to stop. "How was the museum?" he asked. She argued with the information placard about anglerfish, Celestine said. "It was wrong," Maisie said, without looking up from the book. "In what sense?" "The depth range was off," Maisie said. "I told the docent." "How did the docent receive that?" "Poorly at first," Celestine said, "better by the end." Maisie had the library book. "I always bring a backup," Maisie said. Nolan sat down in his armchair and looked at the 2 of them on his living room floor, and thought that there was not a single component of what he was looking at that he would change. Not the slightly wrong depth range on the anglerfish placard, not the library book as backup evidence, not the fact that his kitchen drawer now worked, not the burned toast from a Saturday in January, not the 2 bright lights at Archer's at 20 past midnight when this had all been still theoretical. He would not change any of it. Celestine looked up and found him watching them. She held his gaze for a moment with the particular look she had when she knew what he was thinking and had decided not to say it, the look that had evolved over months, from careful guarding into something that was almost its own form of intimacy. She turned back to the book. The bioluminescence section is actually fascinating, she told Maisie, but I want to hear more about your argument with the placard first. Okay, Maisie said, and launched directly back in. What Nolan had not expected in any of his imagining of what a relationship with Celestine Rowe might require of him was that the hardest adjustment would have nothing to do with money. It would have nothing to do with cameras or boardrooms, or the particular texture of being a middle-class logistics manager attached to a $4 billion name. Those were real, and they required real navigation, but they were external. They had solutions, or at least management strategies. The hardest adjustment was internal. It was the work of letting himself be, without the habitual protection he'd developed over 4 years of being solely responsible for the entire architecture of his family's stability. It was the specific difficulty of accepting that someone else's presence in his life was not a complication to be managed, but an actual addition that the kitchen felt different when she was in it, not because it was more complicated, but because it was more complete, and that being more complete was something he was allowed to want. He'd told himself for years that what he wanted didn't require much room, that he'd simplified his expectations down to the necessary, Maisie's well-being his job, the maintenance of a life that functioned. He'd believed it. He'd even been largely right about it, in the sense that those things had been genuinely sufficient. But sufficient is not the same as full. He understood the difference now. He was understanding it on a Sunday afternoon in April, when Celestine was at his kitchen table reading. Her glasses on, she wore them only for reading, and it had taken him 2 months before she stopped taking them off when he walked into the room, which he'd counted as a significant development. And Maisie was at the other end of the table with her homework, and the window above the sink showed the first genuinely warm afternoon of the year, and nobody was talking. And the silence had the specific quality of silence between people who don't need to fill it. "You're staring again," Celestine said, without looking up. "I'm thinking," he said. "You tend to do both simultaneously." Maisie, not looking up from her homework, said, "He does. It's the face." Celestine turned a page. "I've named it." Nolan looked between them. "You've named my face?" "The specific face," Celestine said. "Not all of them." "What did you name it?" "The inventory face," Maisie said. "'Cause you look like you're counting something," Celestine said, "and deciding whether it adds up." He sat with that for a moment. They were both still looking at their respective reading material. Neither of them was making a thing of it. It was the observation of two people who had been paying attention and had compared notes at some point when he wasn't aware they were doing so. "Does it add up?" Maisie asked, still not looking up. He looked at them both, his daughter, with her homework and her pencil, and her specific inability to let a thing go unanswered, and the woman across the table who had driven to his apartment on a Saturday in December and said the most difficult thing she'd said in years and meant every word of it. "Yeah," he said. "It adds up." Maisie nodded, satisfied, and returned to her homework. Celestine turned another page. The afternoon light came through the window and landed on the kitchen table, and nobody moved. He didn't say the other thing yet, the thing that had been building since January, that had become unambiguous in March, that was now sitting in him with the settled weight of something that has found its correct location. He didn't say it because the moment didn't need it. The moment was already complete. There would be time for the words. There was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely enough time. He got up and started on dinner, and Maisie asked if she could pick the music, and he said yes because he always said yes. And she put on something she'd been listening to obsessively for 2 weeks that was either very good or very repetitive, depending on one's perspective. Celestine looked up from her book and said, "This again?" "It's a good song," Maisie said firmly. "It's the same song. You've played it 11 times this week. How do you know how many times?" "I counted," Celestine said, and went back to her book. Maisie looked at her father. He was chopping onions and maintaining a neutral expression with the practiced effort of a man who had learned that Maisie read amusement as encouragement. She counted. Maisie said, with a tone that was half indignation and half something that sounded, underneath, like satisfaction. "Tension," Nolan said. Maisie considered this. "Fine," she said. And the song kept playing, and nobody turned it off. And dinner happened at 6:30 instead of 6, because the onions took longer than expected, and nobody was keeping strict track, And the evening arrived the way good evenings do, quietly, without fanfare, settling over everything like something that was simply meant to be there. The idea came to him on a Tuesday morning in September, standing in the cereal aisle of the grocery store, with a box of something Maisie had requested in his hand and his phone in the other, reading a text she'd sent him from school that said, "Don't forget the kind with the red lid, not the blue lid. They taste different, even though they look the same." He was standing there, reading this, when he looked up and saw, directly across the aisle, a woman holding a book she'd apparently carried in from outside, the kind of thing you only do when you're so deep into something you can't set it down, and the image of it, the complete unself-consciousness of a person too absorbed in a book to care how it looked, reminded him so immediately and completely of Celestine that he stood still for a moment in the cereal aisle of an ordinary grocery store and understood, with a clarity that didn't require any build-up, exactly what he was going to do and where he was going to do it. Put the red lid cereal in the cart and took out his phone and called Derek. "I need a favor," he said. Derek, who had been waiting for approximately 9 months for some version of this call, said, finally, before Nolan had specified what the favor was. "You don't know what I'm asking yet. Doesn't matter." "Yes." Nolan told him what he needed. Derek listened without interrupting, which was not his natural state, which meant he understood the weight of the request. When Nolan finished, Derek said, "The bookstore. You're going to do it at the bookstore." "Yes. Not a restaurant, not somewhere with a view. A used bookstore. She'll understand why." A brief pause. "Yeah," Derek said, more quietly than usual. "She will." Another pause. "What do you need me to do?" "Maisie," Nolan said. "I need her there, but I can't bring her. It has to look like a coincidence until it isn't. You want me to get a 9-year-old to a bookstore at a specific time and make it look spontaneous. Can you do it?" "Nolan," Derek said, "Maisie has been asking me for 3 weeks to take her to Bramblewood to look for a specific book about deep-sea fish that the library doesn't have. This is not going to be a difficult ask." He exhaled. "Thank you. Don't thank me. Just don't mess it up." He hung up. He stood in the cereal aisle for another moment, aware that he was a 36-year-old logistics manager holding a box of cereal in a grocery store, who had just decided to propose to a woman with $4 billion in a second-hand bookshop with no ring, and that this was either the most sensible or least sensible decision he'd ever made, and he genuinely couldn't tell which. Put it in the same category as Table 7 and kept moving. There was one other thing he needed to do before Saturday, and it was the thing that required more from him than the logistics. He drove to the cemetery on a Wednesday evening after work, when the light was going the particular amber of early September, and the air had that first suggestion of change in it that came before the actual change. He hadn't been since spring. He came when he could, which was less often than he'd intended in the early years, and more often than he'd managed in the middle ones. And he'd stopped measuring his adequacy by the frequency a long time ago, because that kind of measurement served nobody. He sat on the bench near Laura's stone and said nothing for a while. He'd never been comfortable with the idea of talking out loud in cemeteries. It felt performative to him in a way he couldn't get past. The sense that the performance was for himself rather than for the person he was addressing, and Laura had never had much patience for performance. So he just sat, the way he'd learned to sit with difficult things, and let the thoughts arrange themselves without forcing them into sentences. What he was thinking about was not permission. He'd worked through that concept years ago and understood that it was the wrong frame, that Laura had not left behind a version of herself that waited in some capacity to grant or withhold approval for the choices he made in her absence. What had existed was a person, and the person was gone, and what remained was the love he'd had for her, which was real and permanent, and the daughter they'd made together, who was 10 in 3 weeks and currently incapable of passing a bookstore without going in, which was not a coincidence. What he was thinking about was something simpler. He was thinking about the specific conversation he and Laura had had very early in their marriage, about what they each wanted from the other in the event that the worst happened. They'd had it because someone in Laura's family had been through a difficult period and the subject had come up, and they were young enough and honest enough to say the things that older versions of themselves might have avoided. Laura had been direct, the way she was about everything. "I want you to be happy. I want Maisie to be happy. I don't want either of you to hold on to me in a way that prevents that. I want to be something you carry, not something that stops you." He'd said the same to her. They'd agreed on it, which was the way they agreed on most things, not without difficulty, but without ambiguity once the difficulty was worked through. He sat on the bench and thought, "I think I found her. I think she's genuinely good. I think Maisie already knows it. He sat a while longer. The light changed. He stood up, put his hands in his pockets, and walked back to his car. He slept better that Wednesday night than he had in weeks. The book he'd chosen was one Celestine had handed to him over a shelf at Bramblewood in February, with the specific look she used when she thought something was important. He'd read it in 4 days. It was a novel about two people who kept missing each other across years and geography until the circumstances that had always conspired against them finally ran out of material, and the ending was not tidy, but it was true. He'd handed it back to her when he finished and said, I see why you wanted me to read it. And she'd said, I thought you would. And that had been the entire conversation, which was sufficient. He'd gone back to Bramblewood on a Thursday in late September and found a copy of the same book, not hers. A different copy, older, the spine more worn, the pages with the particular soft texture of a book that had been read by multiple people who had each left some residual warmth in the paper. He'd bought it and brought it home and put it on his nightstand, and told himself he'd know when the moment was right. Saturday arrived with the specific quality of a day that doesn't know it's significant. The weather was the cooperative kind, not aggressively beautiful, just decent. The September air, at that particular temperature, where a jacket is optional, and the decision about whether to wear one is itself a kind of small pleasure. Nolan was showered and dressed by 9:30, and trying to remember if he'd ever been this calm before doing something that mattered this much. He decided he hadn't, and that the calmness was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of certainty, which was a different animal entirely. He texted Derek, "We're heading over at 11. You good?" Derek texted back, already at the bookstore. Maisie found the fish book. She's been arguing with me about anglerfish for 20 minutes. Please hurry. He texted back, "You're doing great." Derek sent back a single period, which was his version of resignation. Called Celestine at 10. She was in her home office. She worked Saturday mornings when she didn't have a reason not to, which was a habit she'd acknowledged was probably not going to change entirely, and which he'd accepted as part of the actual person rather than something to negotiate. He'd understood early that asking her to stop being who she was in exchange for a relationship with him was not a trade she should have to make, and that the version of her that sat at his kitchen table on weekends and fixed cabinet hinges and argued with Maisie about anglerfish was not a departure from who she was professionally, but a continuation of it, the same precision, the same intensity, directed at different material. "I want to show you something," he said when she picked up. "What kind of something?" "The kind that requires going to Bramblewood." Pause. He could hear her chair now. "Around 11. Is this a book recommendation situation or an actual errand?" "Neither," he said. Another pause, this one with a different quality. "All right," she said. "I'll come to you," he said. "We can go from there." He picked her up at her building at 10:40. She came out in the coat he recognized from the first winter. She had many coats, but returned to this one with the Bramblewood tote on her shoulder, which struck him as so precisely herself that he almost said it out loud and didn't. In the car, she looked at him with the measuring look she used when she was trying to read a situation without sufficient data. "You're doing the face," she said. "The inventory face?" "A different one," she considered. "I don't have a name for this one yet." "Maybe don't name it until after," he said. She looked at him for another moment and then turned to the window with the expression of someone who has decided to wait and see, which was an expression he associated with her best qualities, the ability to sit with uncertainty without requiring it to resolve prematurely. Bramblewood on a Saturday morning in September was the version of itself he liked best, busy enough to feel alive, not so crowded that the narrow aisles became impossible. A particular smell of it hit them both when they pushed through the door, the warm, dry, particular smell of used books that accumulated over years and couldn't be replicated or manufactured. The owner, a thin man in his 60s named Hartwell, who had known Celestine for years, and greeted her with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd watched her spend a significant amount of money on books he'd have otherwise struggled to move, nodded at them from behind the register and went back to his cataloging. Nolan steered them toward the back, past the military history, past the oversized art books, past the spinning rack of paperback mysteries that had been there since the store opened and appeared to operate on a closed ecosystem of rotating titles, toward the section she'd described the first night at Archer's. The section of books that didn't fit anywhere else. He heard Maisie before he saw her, but the documented depth range in the Jensen survey was significantly lower than what the exhibit said, And the docent actually agreed with me once I showed him the citation, so the placard has been incorrect since at least March and nobody fixed it. Derek's voice. You've mentioned this. Several times. Because it matters. The anglerfish are fine, Maisie. Placard is not fine, Derek. Celestine stopped walking. She was looking at the end of the aisle, where Maisie had apparently been positioned near the nature section and was gesturing at a book she'd opened to a specific page while Derek stood beside her with the expression of a man whose morning had required significantly more than he'd anticipated. Why is Maisie here? Celestine said. Her voice was very even. She wanted to find a book, Nolan said. Celestine looked at him. The measuring look had intensified Nolan, Celestine. She turned to look at Maisie again, who had not yet noticed them, or was, Nolan suspected, doing a very good impression of not noticing them, because Maisie's situational awareness was generally excellent and the aisle was not large. Derek had noticed them and was maintaining his expression with the effortful neutrality of a man who had been specifically instructed to look natural. Nolan reached into his jacket pocket and took out the book. Celestine looked at it. She looked at his face. He watched something move through her expression, the recognition, the understanding of what the book was, and then the beginning of something else that she was trying to hold still because Celestine always tried to hold things still first, before letting them be what they were. The February book, she said. Different copy, he said. Same book. She looked at him. He had thought at various points in the weeks of planning this about what he would say. He'd tried several versions in his head, and none of them had come out right, because the right version of it was not a speech, and he wasn't a speech-making person. He was a person who said what he meant with the minimum of decoration, which was something she had understood about him from the beginning, and, he believed, actually valued. So he said it the way he would say anything true to her. When I sat down at table 7, he said, I didn't know anything about you. I didn't know what you owned, or what you'd built, or what the world thought of you. I just knew that you had very strong opinions about a dessert display you'd evaluated from across the room before anyone had spoken a word, and that when you laughed it was the unguarded version and not the other kind. He held the book. Everything I found out afterward didn't change what I already knew. You kept showing up. For me. For Maisie. For a kitchen drawer that was bothering you. For Tuesday evenings with a 9-year-old who thinks every expert is mildly wrong about something. He paused. Kept showing up, and you didn't make it into a performance. That's the thing that got me. You just did it. Her expression had moved through the holding still stage. She was looking at him with everything present, no management, no calibration, no distance, and it was the most completely he'd seen her face in almost a year of seeing her. I don't have a ring, he said. I thought about getting one, and then I thought that a woman who built a $4 billion infrastructure empire from a house with things that stayed broken until she fixed them herself should probably be trusted to choose her own ring. Something cracked at the corner of her eyes. She pressed her lips together. Crack stayed. So I brought the book instead, he said, because it seemed like the right object for this particular question. He looked at her. Celestine. Will you marry me? He said it without the upward inflection of a question because he wasn't uncertain, and it was not in his nature to perform uncertainty for the sake of convention. She made a sound. It was not words. Exactly. At first it was the sound of someone who has been holding something together with considerable effort for a long time and has just been told they don't have to anymore. Her hand came up to her mouth and she laughed, very suddenly, which was the unguarded version, the one that still sometimes caught him, because it was so completely different from every other thing about her composed exterior. There's no ring, she said. I mentioned that. You're holding a used paperback. I'm aware. She looked at the book. She looked at him. She laughed again, shorter this time, and then she reached up and pressed her hand against the side of his face, which she had never done before in any context, and it was the most straightforwardly tender thing he could recall anyone doing in recent memory. Yes, she said, before he had drawn breath for the next sentence. Yes. Obviously, yes. From the end of the aisle came the sound of a 9-year-old who had been in the nature section for the precise length of time required and had apparently determined that sufficient time had elapsed. Maisie appeared around the shelf and crossed the distance at a speed that suggested she had not, in fact, been paying full attention to the anglerfish placard dispute and had been monitoring the aisle peripherally for several minutes. She wrapped both arms around both of them, with the complete unself-conscious force of a child who has decided that the adult world has finally arrived at the correct conclusion. Nolan put his arm around her. Celestine put her arm around her from the other side. The three of them stood between the shelves of uncategorizable fiction and the nature section and the spinning rack of paperback mysteries, and nobody said anything for a moment. Derek, from a respectful distance, said, "Should I do I go?" "Stay," Maisie said, muffled by the general embrace. "You helped." "I did basically nothing," Derek said. "You kept me company while I waited," Maisie said. "That counts. For 20 minutes of anglerfish." "The anglerfish are relevant," Maisie said. "I'll explain it later." Hartwell, behind his register at the front of the store, appeared to notice that something was happening in the back of his shop and elected, with the good judgment of a man who had been running a bookstore for 30 years and understood that certain moments needed no interference, to return to his cataloging. They left Bramblewood at 12:30 with 4 books, a receipt that Maisie had examined for accuracy, and a decision that the rest of the afternoon would be spent at Nolan's apartment in the manner that had become the definition of their Saturdays, meaning without a plan, which was the plan. In the car on the way back, Maisie sat in the back seat and said, "What kind of ring are you going to get?" "I haven't decided yet," Celestine said. "Something practical." "That's your criterion?" "You fix things," Maisie said. "You don't want something that gets in the way." Celestine looked at Nolan. He kept his eyes on the road with the practiced expression of a man who had learned that some conversations were between Maisie and the world, and his job was to drive. "That's a reasonable point," Celestine said. "I have good points," Maisie said, and opened her new fish book. They got engaged on a Saturday in September and did not tell anyone for 3 weeks, which was not a deliberate strategy, but a natural result of the fact that neither of them was particularly motivated to perform the announcement before they'd had time to simply be in possession of it. People who mattered found out gradually and in person. Mrs. Farrell, told by Nolan on a Tuesday, said, "Well, it's about time," and went back inside to make tea. Derek, who technically already knew everything, called to say he was taking credit for Table 7 for the rest of his life, which Nolan told him was probably fair. Celestine called her sister the one person in her family she was close to, a woman named Margot who lived in Portland and had, according to Celestine, been waiting for this call since February with the patient certainty of someone who trusted the situation more than Celestine did. Margot cried. Celestine did not cry on the phone but was notably quiet in the hours after, and didn't explain it and didn't need to. The ring, when Celestine chose it, was a narrow band with a single dark stone, not what anyone would have predicted based on what she could afford, which was deliberately the point. She chose it from an estate jewelry dealer in Columbus on a Tuesday afternoon, when alone, and brought it home and showed it to Nolan and Maisie at the kitchen table that evening. Maisie examined it with the seriousness she brought to all factual assessments. "Is that a black diamond?" "Dark gray," Celestine said. "Technically a salt and pepper diamond. Is it practical?" "Completely." Maisie looked at it for another moment. "I like it," she said, with the finality of someone issuing a ruling, and handed it back. Celestine put it on. She looked at it on her hand at the kitchen table, with an expression Nolan had not seen before, something that was neither her professional composure nor the particular openness she'd developed in his presence, but a third thing, quieter than both, the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they'd stopped believing they'd reach. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. They married in June, 11 months after the bookstore, and 20 months after Table 7. The ceremony was in the garden of a house that a friend of Celestine's owned outside Columbus, not the elaborate, managed garden of a property designed to impress, but the real kind, with a stone path that went slightly uneven in one spot, and a corner where the roses had gotten ahead of themselves and nobody had gotten around to disciplining them yet. There were 41 people. Every single one of them was someone who had been in the room during an actual part of the story, not the narrative version, the real one, the one with the Archer's pie and the burned toast and the cabinet drawer and the December hallway and the September bookstore. Derek gave a speech that was about 60% sincere and 40% a detailed account of Table 7 from his vantage point at Table 4, which was both funnier and more accurate than Nolan had expected. Mrs. Farrell wore a hat she'd apparently been saving for a significant occasion. Margot, Celestine's sister, sat in the front row with the expression of someone who had been right about something for a long time and was choosing not to mention it. Maisie, who had been consulted extensively about her role in the ceremony and had expressed opinions about every component with the thoroughness of someone who had been thinking about this longer than anyone, stood at Nolan's side in a dress she'd chosen herself practical. She'd said, "I need to be able to move," and held a book, because she'd decided the flowers seemed like a lot of maintenance, and the book was more honest, and also she'd been in the middle of something good and didn't see why a wedding should prevent reading during the slow parts. Celestine had said, "Read the book." Maisie had said, "Obviously I'm going to read the book. I'm asking if anyone will mind." Celestine had said, "Anyone who minds doesn't know you well enough to be there." Maisie had looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was not quite her usual assessing look, but something more complicated and more personal, and then she'd said, with a quietness that was not her ordinary volume, "I don't call you anything yet. I've been trying to figure out what to call you." "You don't have to call me anything specific," Celestine had said. "You can figure it out when it feels right. What if it takes a long time?" "Then it takes a long time. I'm not going anywhere." Maisie had nodded, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone processing something significant. "Okay," she'd said. And that had been the entire conversation. And it had been enough. At the ceremony, during the vows, Nolan and Celestine had each written their own, which had involved more difficulty than either of them had anticipated, and multiple drafts that they hadn't shared with each other in advance. His were short. He was not a person for whom length equaled meaning, and she knew that and had expected it. He said that he'd sat down at table 7 because a coworker had ambushed him with his own schedule, and that he'd stayed because she'd correctly predicted the inspirational speech within 2 minutes, and that he'd called her after finding a magazine cover in a break room, because the Sundays had been real and the rest was just numbers, and that everything he'd learned about her since had only confirmed what he'd understood. That first night, that she was someone who paid attention in a way that most people didn't, and that he intended to spend however much time he had returning the attention in kind. Celestine's vows were longer. She'd written them out and then reduced them, which was visible in the cadence, the compression of someone who had originally said more and made herself stop. She said that she had spent a long time believing that the version of her life that included the kind of ordinary, daily, continuous closeness she'd watched other people build was not a version available to her, not because of the money, not because of the public exposure, but because she'd taken the disappointments of her earlier life and used them to build a structure that was excellent at keeping things out, including the things worth letting in. She said she had sat down at table 7 with no particular expectation, because she had stopped having particular expectations, and that the specific quality of his attention, the way he had looked at her like she was someone to be known rather than something to be assessed, had undone something in her that she hadn't realized was still capable of being undone. She said that she had been afraid of it for a long time after that. She said that she was not afraid of it anymore. She looked at Maisie when she said the last part. Maisie, who had been reading but had lowered the book for the vows, looked back at her. And something passed between them that was not a word and not a gesture and not a category that had an existing name, but that everyone in the garden who was paying attention recognized as real. The reception was on the same property, in a tent that was practical rather than spectacular, because Celestine had been offered spectacular and had chosen practical with the decisiveness of someone who had always known the difference between impressive and right. The food was good. The speeches ran long because Derek's had set a tone that encouraged follow-up remarks. Mrs. Farrell stayed until 9 o'clock, which was unprecedented. Maisie fell asleep in a chair at 10, and Nolan carried her inside, the way he'd been carrying her since she was small, and when he came back out, Celestine was standing at the edge of the tent with her shoes off, and her feet in the grass, and her crossed in the way she stood when she was thinking about something. He stood beside her. The tent was still lit behind them, warm and noisy. The garden was dark and quiet. "How are you doing?" he said. She looked at the dark. "I'm trying to locate how I feel," she said. It's quite a lot of feeling. Is that okay?" She turned to look at him with the expression that was all 3 things at once, the precision, the warmth, and the third thing that had no name, the one that had arrived sometime in the first winter and taken up permanent residence. "Yes," she said. "It's quite okay." He put his arm around her. She leaned into it, which was not something she'd done easily in the beginning, and did now without noticing. He noticed. He would always notice. The grass was cool. Tent was warm. Somewhere in the house, Maisie was asleep, with her book still open on her chest, the way she always fell asleep. the way her mother had fallen asleep, the way some things persist through the people who carry them forward into the lives that come after. In the months that followed, Celestine's mansion became a place she visited rather than a place she lived. The decision was not announced or argued over. It materialized from the accumulated fact of where she actually was most evenings, which was Nolan's apartment, which was full of mismatched furniture and the wrong volume of music and a drawer that now worked and a coffee maker that was 15 years old and never going to be replaced. She kept an office there and a presence, and the staff who had managed the property for years continued to do so. But the rooms where she worked the longest and slept the soundest and cooked the most spectacularly mediocre pancakes of her professional life were not in that building. They were in an apartment on the 4th floor of a building in Columbus, Ohio, where a 9-year-old turned 10 and then 11, and where a logistics manager kept getting promoted because he was good at his job and had no intention of being otherwise, and where every Sunday morning still began with a drawn breakfast order on a notepad because some things become permanent, not by being designated as such, but simply by continuing. Maisie settled on a name in October, 14 months after the wedding. She said it casually, at dinner, without preamble, Celestine. Can you pass the salt? Not a title, just the name, said with the ease of something that had always been true. Celestine passed the salt. She did not make a thing of it, which was exactly right. Later, when Maisie was in her room, Nolan found Celestine standing at the kitchen sink with the water running and her hands still, looking at the window where the October dark had turned the glass into a mirror. Came to stand beside her. She said nothing for a moment. He waited. 14 months, she said finally. She took exactly the time she needed. She always does, he said. Celestine turned the water off. She stood there for another moment, her reflection looking back at her in the window glass, older than the woman who had sat down at table 7, different in the ways that only time and trust and the accumulated weight of being genuinely known by people who chose to stay can make a person different. What are you thinking? He asked. She turned from the window. That I used to think belonging was something you negotiated, she said. Transaction. You gave the right things to the right people in the right quantity and they kept you. She looked at him steadily. I don't think that anymore. What do you think now? She looked at the kitchen around them, the coffee maker, the fixed drawer, the stack of books on the counter that belonged to Maisie and had been there since Tuesday, the notepad with tomorrow's breakfast, drawings still on it, complicated rendering of something that appeared to involve waffles and possibly a volcano. I think it's just this, she said. It's just people showing up and making the room feel different and not leaving when it gets hard. She looked at him. I think that's all it ever was. He nodded once. She picked up the notepad and looked at Maisie's drawing. Is this a volcano? I think it's the syrup, he said. There's a significant amount of syrup. She has strong opinions about syrup. She has strong opinions about everything, Celestine said, with the particular tone she used when this was the thing she found most completely and permanently correct about the world. She set the notepad back on the counter, exactly where it had been. And in the morning, Nolan made breakfast from the drawing waffles, with syrup applied in a quantity that Celestine described as structurally significant, and Maisie described it as correct, and the kitchen was loud, and the coffee was good, and the drawer that had once stuck opened cleanly on the first try, the way things do when someone has finally taken the time to fix them properly, which turns out to be all they ever needed. 3 years after Table 7, Nolan Beckett was running late. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the reason, which was that he'd spent 20 minutes standing in his closet trying to decide what to wear to a used bookstore on a Saturday morning, which was a thing he had never once, in his adult life, considered a decision requiring deliberation. He owned 2 blazers. He put on the darker one, and then took it off and put on a flannel shirt instead, because Celestine had told him once, very early, that she'd known he was worth talking to when she saw he wasn't dressed to perform anything. And it seemed important, today of all days, to remain consistent with that original impression. Maisie knocked on his bedroom door at 9:45. Are you ready? She asked through the door. Almost. You've been almost for 15 minutes. I'm aware. Pause. Are you nervous? He opened the door. She was standing in the hallway in the green jacket she'd picked for herself at the beginning of fall, which she'd been wearing 3 times a week since, because she'd declared it her best jacket and intended to get the full use of it, regardless of whether it matched anything. She was 12 now, had been 12 for 2 months. The 12 had arrived in a way the previous years hadn't, less gradually, more sudden, like a door opening into a room that was slightly larger than the one before. A little, he said. She looked at him with the expression she'd inherited and refined over the years, the one that landed directly on what was true without requiring it to be stated. She's going to say yes, Maisie said. She already said yes. I know that. Then what are you nervous about? He looked at his daughter for a moment. She was holding her book, the current one, a thick novel about a girl who sailed alone across an ocean, and waiting with the patience she applied to questions she considered genuinely interesting rather than merely polite. I want to get it right, he said, not perfectly, just right. Maisie considered this distinction. What's the difference? It means no mistakes. Right means it means what you want it to mean. He pulled on his jacket. I've had enough time to know which one matters. She thought about it for another moment, then nodded, with the slow deliberateness that meant she was filing something away for later rather than just accepting it. Okay, she said. Let's go. Celestine was waiting at the corner of Bramblewood's block when they arrived, which meant she'd been there for some minutes before they pulled up. She was wearing the coat, not because it was particularly cold yet, October being mild this year, but because it was the coat, the one she'd had since before they met, and Nolan had noticed over 3 years that she wore it the way some people wore particular shoes, not for the weather but for the occasion. She was looking at the bookstore window with an expression he recognized as the one she wore when she was trying not to look like she was paying attention to something, which meant she was paying complete attention. She turned when they got out of the car and looked at them both. She looked at Nolan. He saw her take in the flannel shirt, and something shifted in her expression in a way that told him she knew exactly why he'd made that choice. You're late, she said. We know, Maisie said. He couldn't decide what to wear. I see he'd landed on the correct answer, Celestine said. He almost wore the blazer, Maisie said. I'm standing right here, Nolan said. They went into Bramblewood. What Nolan had planned for this morning was not elaborate. Elaborate would have been wrong. Everything about their beginning had been accidental and unadorned, and the meaning of it had been in exactly that quality, the absence of architecture. What he'd planned was simply this: to walk through the store the way they'd walked through it hundreds of times, to find the back section, the uncategorizable fiction, and to be there with both of them, and to say the thing he'd been carrying since the spring in the place where it made the most sense to say it. He'd also arranged, 3 days earlier, for Hartwell to set aside a particular table in the back reading corner, 2 chairs and a small lamp, and the kind of deliberate impermanence that suggested someone had thought about it without making it look thought about. Hartwell had asked no questions, which was one of the many reasons Celestine had been coming to his store for 10 years. They moved through the store in the way they always did, which was not together exactly more like a loose orbit, each of them drawn to different sections, converging and separating with the ease of people who'd shared enough space to know they didn't need to stay in physical proximity to remain present to each other. Maisie went immediately to the young adult section, where she'd been tracking a series for 2 months and had reason to believe a new edition had arrived. Celestine drifted toward the fiction shelves with the purposeful casualness of someone who has learned to look unhurried in bookstores because hurry makes you miss the thing you didn't know you were looking for. Nolan followed, about 3 feet behind, watching her the way he'd watched her since October of the year. They met with the attention of someone who has found the thing that makes sense and is aware enough to not take that for granted. She pulled a book from the shelf and read the back. Put it back. Pulled another one. This one she held. This author, she said, without turning around, wrote one book 15 years ago that I found at Bramblewood and read in a weekend, and then couldn't find anything else by her for years. And now here's a second one. Is that good or bad? He asked. It means she took 15 years to write the second book. Celestine turned it over. I find that reassuring. Why? Because it means she wasn't writing for speed. She was writing until it was right. She looked at him over her shoulder. There's a difference. He held her gaze. I know. She looked at him for a moment longer, with the expression that had evolved, over 3 years, into its most complete form, the one that held everything at once. Precision and the warmth and the vulnerability she'd stopped hiding around him, and the something underneath all of it that he didn't have a word for and didn't need one. She turned back to the shelf and tucked the book under her arm. Maisie found her series, she said, nodding toward the far end of the store, where Maisie was visible between shelves, book already open. She'll be occupied for 40 minutes minimum, he said. I know. She ran her hand along the shelf spines. Where are we going? The back, he said. The uncategorizable section. She didn't say anything. She just turned and walked toward the back of the store, and he followed, and the store moved around them the way it always had, warm and dim and smelling of paper, and the particular accumulated history of objects that have passed through many hands. The table Hartwell had set aside was in the corner near the tall window that looked onto the alley, where the light came in at an angle that made everything look slightly more considered than it was. 2 chairs, a lamp with a low warm bulb, a small clear space on the table. Celestine saw it and slowed slightly. She looked at the table and then at him. "Hartwell," she said. "I called ahead." She sat down in one of the chairs. He sat across from her. Between them, the small lamp put out its warm, useless light. It was mid-morning, and the window was providing all the actual illumination, but it looked right, which was its only job. Put his hand in his jacket pocket. Not for a ring, the ring had been chosen and worn for over a year. The dark salt and pepper stone she'd picked from the estate dealer and brought home and put on her own finger with the practicality of someone who knew exactly what they wanted and didn't need the moment to be more than it was. What he had in his pocket was something else. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and set it on the table. Celestine looked at it. "What is that?" "A letter," he said. "I've been writing it since April." She looked at him. "I'm not going to read it to you," he said. "That seemed like too much, but I wanted you to have it." He pushed it across the table toward her. "For when you want to read it alone, which might not be now." She put her hand on it, but didn't unfold it. She looked at it on the table under her hand, with the expression of someone who has just received something they weren't prepared for and is deciding how to hold it. "What does it say?" she asked quietly. "It says everything I'm not very good at saying in conversation," he said. "Which isn't because I don't feel it. It's because I learned to compress things a long time ago, when compression was necessary, and it became the habit, and some things deserve more room than the habit allows." She still had her hand on the letter. She was not looking at him yet. "It says that watching you become comfortable in my kitchen is one of the most significant things I've experienced as an adult," he continued. "Not dramatic. Not the kind of thing that looks like anything from the outside. But I was there when it happened, and I know what it cost you and what it meant that you did it anyway." He paused. "It says that I know you find the ordinary difficult in a way you don't advertise. That you were built by years and circumstances and choices you made to survive them, to operate in structures, and that choosing a life that doesn't have much structure, with a man who makes decisions based on what feels right rather than what's strategic, and a kid who argues with every placard at every exhibit she's ever attended, that was not a small thing for you to choose." Now she looked at him. "It says I see that," he said, "every day. I see what you gave up and what you built in its place, and it is not lost on me, and it will not be as long as I'm here." Corner of her left eye had the crack in it again, the one he'd first seen at Bramblewood, on the day he'd proposed with a used paperback, the one that meant the holding still had found its limit. She pressed her lips together briefly. "It didn't help much. You said you weren't good at saying things in conversation," she said. "I've been practicing," he said. "The letter is better." She made the sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one, the surprised, unguarded version that he'd first heard at table 7 when he'd named her dessert prediction, and had been cataloging ever since because it was, in his complete assessment of everything he found remarkable about her, the thing that remained most entirely hers. She folded both hands around the letter and held it without opening it. Across the store, they could hear Maisie, not words, just the particular quality of her moving through a space, the occasional soft exhale of someone deep in a book. "I want to tell you something," Celestine said. "All right." She looked at the table, then at him, then at the lamp for a moment, the way she looked at neutral objects when she was finding the exact words for something she didn't want to approximate. "When I registered for that mixer," she said, "I used only my first name and the vaguest professional description I could construct, and I told myself it was because I wanted to meet people without the weight of what I'd built preceding me. That was true." She paused. "What I didn't admit to myself until much later was that I was also testing something. Whether, if I stripped away everything that made me legible to the world as a person worth knowing, the company, the money, the reputation, whether there was still something there that someone would sit down across from and choose to stay." He said nothing. "You didn't know any of it," she said, "and you stayed. You moved your water glass, and you argued about the dessert display, and you stayed until the room was empty, and then you walked out into the cold and asked for coffee at midnight, with the straightforwardness of someone who had simply decided he wanted to keep talking." She looked at him steadily. I had not experienced that before. Not in that form. Not without the other things being part of the reason. The Sundays were the reason, he said. I know, she said. You told me that once, in a parking lot, on the phone, and I cried after I hung up. She said it without apology. Not because it was sad. Because I hadn't been sure it was possible anymore, and then it was. He reached across the small table and put his hand over hers, over her hands, and the letter folded between them. It was always possible, he said. You just needed someone who wasn't interested in the other thing. You were so entirely uninterested in the other thing, she said, with a wryness that was also completely serious. I found it alarming at first. I know, I could tell. You waited anyway. I'm patient, he said. It's another form of stubbornness, if you want to be technical about it. She looked at him for a long moment with everything present. Then she turned her hand over under his and held it. There are things that don't look like much from the outside. A man and a woman in the back corner of a used bookstore, holding hands across a small table under a lamp that wasn't doing much. No cameras, no occasion. No architecture of significance. Just two people in their late 30s who had arrived at the same place from very different directions and had, over the course of 3 years, built something that couldn't be reduced to its components, not the money, not the absence of it, not the status difference or the public exposure or the logistics of two lives becoming one. Something that was the sum of Tuesday evenings and burned toast and a fixed drawer and a 9-year-old who argued about anglerfish and a December doorway and a letter written since April and a phone call in a parking lot that had said the only thing that needed saying. Two people who had, in the end, simply decided to stop protecting themselves from the thing they actually wanted. Maisie found them 20 minutes later. She came around the corner of the fiction shelf with her book open and her finger holding a page and her expression carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who has found exactly what they were looking for. She looked at the two of them at the table. She looked at their hands. I found the book, she said. Good, Nolan said. She came and stood between the two chairs and looked at both of them with the assessing patience that had been her defining quality since she was old enough to form opinions. Are you done being serious? Mostly, Celestine said. Good. Because I have questions about the ending of the last one, and you told me we could talk about it here. We can talk about it here, Celestine said. Maisie pulled over the small wooden stool that lived near that shelf. She'd discovered it on her second or third visit and claimed it as hers with the uncomplicated confidence of a person who notices useful things and makes use of them, and sat down and opened to the page she'd been thinking about and began, without further preamble, explaining the specific narrative choice she wanted to interrogate. Celestine let go of Nolan's hand and turned to face Maisie and engaged with the question at full strength, the way she always did, the way she had from the first afternoon, with the dinosaur diagrams on the back of a book report. Nolan sat back in his chair and watched them. He thought about something he'd read in the book Celestine had given him in February, the one about two people who kept missing each other until the circumstances ran out of material. There was a line near the end that he'd read twice and then set the book down and looked at the ceiling for a while. The line was, "It turns out the thing I was waiting for was not a particular feeling, but a particular willingness in myself, and in another person at the same time." He'd understood it when he read it. He understood it better now. What he'd learned in the 3 years since a woman with a worn tote bag and strong opinions about dessert displays had sat down across from him at table 7 was not what he'd expected to learn. He'd expected, if he was honest, to learn something about the complications of loving someone with an enormous amount of money, the navigation of it, the management, the particular friction of two worlds with different grammars trying to become one. He'd expected that to be the central difficulty, the thing that required the most from both of them. It wasn't. The money was real, and the complications were real, and there had been moments, the photographs, the boardroom conversations he heard about secondhand, school pickup with the well-meaning mother, where the weight of that world had pressed against the one he was trying to protect with everything he had. Those moments had been hard. He would not diminish them. But the central difficulty had been something older and quieter and more interior than any of that. It had been the work of two people learning, in their mid-30s, after years of being shaped by loss and disappointment, and the various protective architectures they'd each built to survive those things. How to remain open to something good without managing it to death. That was the actual work. Everything else was logistics. He'd learned that the version of himself who had sat in a parking lot for 10 minutes after seeing a magazine cover Working out what he actually believed before making any decisions was the version of himself he was most consistently glad to be. Not the version that ran, not the version that collapsed the distance between thought and action, in ways that skipped the necessary middle, the version that sat still long enough to know what was true. He'd learned that Maisie's instincts about people were, in fact, as accurate as Laura's had been, and that this continuity, the way certain essential things persisted through the people who carried them forward, was not a source of grief, but of something more complicated and more sustaining than grief. It was evidence of something. He wasn't always sure what, but it felt, on the days he was paying attention, like the opposite of loss. He'd learned that Celestine Rowe was a person who fixed cabinet drawers when she needed something to do while she waited, who had spent years reading books about women who did things without asking permission, who had offered her most unguarded laugh to a stranger in a hotel ballroom over a dessert prediction, and who had walked to his door on a December Saturday with no strategy and no resources deployed and said the most difficult thing she'd said in years because she'd decided that controlling the outcome was no longer worth the cost of what it prevented. He'd learned that the specific quality of her attention, the way she noticed things and remembered them and returned to them weeks later, with the evidence that she'd continued to think about them, was not a professional skill that happened to transfer to personal life. It was the core of who she was. It was the thing that made her formidable, and the thing that made her, once she let it, capable of an intimacy that most people who knew only the public version of her wouldn't have believed possible. He'd learned that ordinary mornings were the unit of measurement that mattered. Not years, not milestones, not the significant events that looked important from the outside. The mornings. The accumulated fact of someone present in your kitchen, making the room feel different by being in it, choosing to be there again the next day. Outside the Bramblewood window, the October street was doing what streets do on Saturday mornings in fall, moving at the particular unhurried pace of a city that has nowhere urgent to be before noon. A man walked by with a coffee. A woman pushed a stroller with one hand and held her phone with the other. Two kids on bikes cut around a corner and disappeared. The ordinary continuous movement of lives being lived without particular drama, which is most of what a life is, which is the part that matters most and gets the least attention. Maisie had shifted the conversation from the ending of the book to a larger point about whether authors owed readers resolution or whether ambiguity was a form of honesty. Celestine was arguing, as she generally argued when she thought someone was wrong about something interesting, at full strength and with complete engagement. The ambiguity isn't the honesty, Celestine said. The ambiguity is what happens when a writer doesn't trust the reader enough to commit. Or, Maisie said, the ambiguity is what happens when a writer trusts the reader enough to finish the story themselves. Pause. That's a reasonable counter, Celestine said, in the tone that meant she was revising. I know, Maisie said. Don't be smug about it. I'm not smug. I'm accurate. There's sometimes a thin line. Between accuracy and smugness? Between confidence and the performance of Celestine said. Accuracy wears confidence, honestly. Smugness wears it for the effect. Maisie thought about this with the serious consideration she gave to things she intended to keep. Okay, she said. That's actually a useful distinction. I have occasional useful distinctions, Celestine said. Nolan watched his daughter absorb this, turn it over, file it somewhere specific. He watched the woman across from her, sitting in a chair in a used bookstore in Columbus, Ohio, on a Saturday morning in October, fully present in the way that presence is only possible when you've stopped performing it and started simply doing it. He watched the way Celestine leaned forward when she was engaged with an argument, the way Maisie mirrored it without knowing. Both of them angled toward the same point, in the conversation with the same intensity, two people who had found in each other a specific and genuine pleasure in the quality of the other's mind. He had not planned any of this. He had not planned Table 7 or the coffee at Archer's or the Sundays or the bookstore or the fixed drawer or the letter in his jacket pocket that he'd been writing since April. He had made none of it happen through strategy or intention or the careful management of outcomes. What he had done was simpler and harder, and the only thing that had ever actually worked in his experience of the things that mattered. He had sat down. He had stayed. He had been honest about what was real and what wasn't, and he had refused consistently, without fanfare, to let the noise of the world outside convince him that the thing he'd found at a table in the back of a ballroom on an October night was less than what it was. That was it. That was the entire architecture. There was no secret component, No principle he'd discovered that wasn't already obvious to anyone who thought about it clearly. It was the same thing it had always been. Show up, stay honest, don't let the fear of being wrong about something beautiful convince you to let it go. The hard part was not knowing the principle. Everyone knows it. The hard part was doing it when it cost something. When a photograph showed up in a parking lot and a daughter said what a classmate's mother had said, and a world outside the kitchen window was loudly explaining why the numbers didn't work. The hard part was holding the thing you knew in the face of all the noise that wanted to make you doubt it. He'd held it. So had she. That, he thought, was the answer to the question Maisie had asked in a December hallway when she was 9 years old and completely right about everything. If you both love each other, why are you saying goodbye? They hadn't had an answer, because the answer, when it finally arrived, was that they weren't. They never really had been. Celestine looked up from the argument and found him watching them again. She held his gaze for a moment across the small corner of the bookstore, across Maisie between them on her stool, across the lamp and the letter still folded on the table, and the book she'd tucked under her arm, and the 11 months of a marriage that had not been easy or perfect or without friction, and had been, in every way that he could assess with his full, honest attention, exactly right. She raised her eyebrows slightly. He shook his head slightly, meaning nothing, meaning everything was fine, meaning he was doing the inventory face, and she should know by now what it meant when he did. She held it for another second. Then the corner of her mouth moved. Not a full smile. Not the performance of one. The early motion of it, the one that belonged only to this, to him seeing her, and her knowing he was seeing her, and neither of them needing it to be more than that. Maisie, tracking the current of the room with the accuracy she'd always had, said, "What?" "Nothing," they both said, at the same time, which meant it wasn't nothing. Which Maisie understood perfectly and accepted because some things between people were theirs, and did not require being made available to anyone else, which was itself a form of respect she'd learned from watching two adults figure out how to be honest with each other and private at the same time. "Fine," she said, and returned to the book argument. Outside, the October morning continued at its own pace. Inside Bramblewood, between the shelves of uncategorizable fiction and the stool, and the lamp that wasn't doing much, and the table where a letter sat folded and unread but fully present, three people who had found each other through the particular luck of a numbered card at a hotel mixer continued the conversation that had, in various forms and registers, been going since the first night. This is what love looks like when it is not a story about grand gestures or impossible obstacles, or the moment when everything clicks into perfect and permanent clarity. It looks like this: a man in a flannel shirt and a woman in a coat she's had for 10 years, and a 12-year-old on a wooden stool arguing about whether ambiguity in fiction is honesty or evasion. It looks like someone's hand on a folded letter. It looks like a lamp that isn't doing much, but looks right anyway. It looks like the word accurate used with affection. It looks like two people who looked at everything that made them wrong for each other and decided that the thing they'd found was larger than the list. It is not the version of the story that looks like anything from the outside. It is from the inside everything. And in the back corner of Bramblewood Books, on a Saturday in October, with the light coming through the alley window at the angle that made everything look slightly more considered than it was. That was exactly what it was. Everything. Without qualification, without remainder, without anything left out.